Chapter 839. The one who spoke was Xia Hui. This was the second time he had emphasized it. It carried an unquestionable might. At this moment, Xia Hui, who was on the mountain's back, was holding the glowing magatama. His heart was more or less burning. It was for his own luck and for the power he was in control of at this moment. The situation in front of him, the time, the place, and the form were all unexpected. But the situation itself, which was Luo Nan's revenge against Yukawa Aishuk, was foretold by the Pope when he sent Luo Nan to be Yukawa Aishuk's bodyguard. Therefore, Xia Hui was very confident. He calmly stimulated the magatama's power and fused it with it. At this moment, his perception became the tip of the Fusang divine tree's roots that pierced through the endless void. He projected everything that was happening in front of him, waiting for the response from the highest level and receiving the incoming godly power. During this time, just the fine tentacles at the end of the root had already unfolded into an intricate and magnificent scroll in front of him. The exquisite uses of the high-end power were presented in an inconceivable geometrical structure and an even more exquisite and microscopic mode of energy usage. The cage master called it a configuration. How appropriate. But how does it feel to be trapped by a configuration? Xia Hui's mental plane was momentarily dazed. This was the unavoidable result of receiving the high-end power. But he was very experienced in this aspect. He quickly gathered his consciousness and calmed his mind to avoid any negative effects. He also had to be careful of the cage master's unpredictable mental invasion. His performance seemed fierce, but every step he took was solid. This was one of the most important reasons why the Pope valued him. Right now, he was in the middle of passing and waiting. It was also at this moment that Xia Hui saw Yukawa Aishuk, whose mouth was crooked due to the interference of the magatama's power. He struggled to move his lips and speak again. It seems that the two in Ban City really have nothing to do with you. Then pass. We will use the elimination method and try a few more times. In the end, you won't be able to hide it. What a loathsome, arrogant and conceited fellow. After the initial, so beautiful, comment, the person behind Yukawa Aishuk no longer paid attention to the configuration scroll on the mental plane. He just stared at Bai Xinyan and said some words that he didn't really understand. On the back of the mountain, Xia Hui was infuriated. It was fine if they ignored him, but in front of the grand structure of the great divine treasure of the Fusang divine tree, no one in this world could display such an attitude. I told you, there won't be a next time. It was a little deliberate to emphasize it for the third time, but Xia Hui was not doing it for his own character. He was doing it for the respect that the two lords of Amaterasu deserved. I've got you. You use a lot of exclamations. What? This sudden sentence caused Xia Hui's thoughts and emotions to stagnate. He was, after all, a Class B mind master, and he was very sensitive to the relevant fields. With this reminder, he did not let himself be led around by the nose. Instead, he suddenly realized a crucial point. Wasn't the feedback from the propping mulberry tree's great divine treasure a little too slow? It was also at this moment that Yukawa Aishuk, with his crooked mouth and slanted eyes, revealed a horrifying smile. That Pope of Baji didn't teach you seriously. Such a complicated configuration. You know how it works, but you don't know why. How can you succeed? Under the effect of the magatama's power, Yukawa Aishuk gradually lost control over the structure of Yukawa Aishuk's body and soul. But the muffled voice in his throat was like a highly viscous acid. It sprayed out and adhered to Xia Hui's face and soul, burning and penetrating. There were two waves of pain. The first wave was the pain of being pierced in the deepest and most private corner of one's heart. The other wave was the unique sense of danger that came from the mind. Oh no, I've been hit. Without giving Xia Hui a chance to analyze it in depth, in the spiritual plane that he saw and sensed, the exquisite composition that had been unfurled actually began to slowly roll back. It was retracted. Xia Hui's eyeballs nearly bulged out of their sockets like Yukawa Aishuk's. His consciousness played no role at all. In fact, it was just as Luo Nan said. The Pope of Baji gave Xia Hui the method to stimulate and maintain the magatama's power, but she did not give him the method to use it flexibly. The Pope of Baji did not go so far as to be selfish. It was mainly because Xia Hui had not reached that level. He did not possess the knowledge reserves. Every structure, every section, and every detail of such a complex structure would affect the entire structure. Xia Hui, who was on the back of the mountain, was able to maintain the stability of the whole structure and successfully act as a fulcrum to sense and feed back information. He was already worthy of the role the church had given him. But this kind of role was not enough in the face of the orderly retraction of the configuration before his eyes. Spilled water was hard to retrieve, but everything that appeared on the mental plane was simply like reversing time. The power of the Fusang divine tree that had already unfurled was retracted bit by bit. It came back the way it came. There was not a trace of error, not a bit of wastage, but even on the mental plane, the circulation of energy had to obey basic laws. How could entropy increase and entropy decrease consume the same amount of energy? The most terrifying expenditure of the effect of reversing time was the astronomical calculation of the law. It consumed Luo Nan's brain power and control. He did it if he wanted to. But the remaining portion was completely squeezed back into the power of the Magatama, and this power was suppressed back to its original state. Xia Hui and the Magatama were affected by the entire activation mechanism. To a certain degree, they were one entity. There was no need to consider the boundaries of the reverse retraction. The retraction of the Magatama's power took advantage of the situation and pushed Xia Hui back in time. Of course, this was an exaggeration. His mental state and mind were completely unprepared for the retraction of the Magatama's power. His entire body was crushed to the point of suffocation. His swollen body instantly deflated. Xia Hui's body looked like it had its bones pulled out. He fell limply to the ground, unconscious. Phew. That was close. Yukawa Isuk sighed as he looked at Xia Hui, who was on the back of the mountain. I almost got myself into big trouble. Fortunately, Luo Nan had fought with the propping mulberry tree system of the Amaterasu cult many times over the past few days. He had seen the brain demon, the horn demon, the fat dragon, and many other similar tricks. Only then was he able to come up with this method of reverse sealing. Of course, this was also because he saw the opportunity quickly and made use of his understanding of the configuration of the great divine treasure of the Fusang divine tree. He also made use of the opportunity when Xia Hui was controlling the Magatama on the back of the mountain and had no time to pay attention to anything else. He took the first step to induce his negative emotions, giving him illusions and misleading him, distorting the feedback of the entire sensory channel. Just this skill alone was enough to prove that he hadn't been communicating with Mr. Bai for half a year. But the more it was like this, the harder it was for Luo Nan to deal a heavy blow to Bai Xinyan. He didn't have much hope that the previous threats would achieve anything. Also, sealing off the mountain back of Xia Hui might not solve the problem once and for all. Perhaps choosing to come here today was a mistake in itself. Luo Nan brought Yukawa Isuk to sigh, breaking the deathly silence in the first-class cabin. He was still the center of attention. Everyone's gazes were filled with fear, bewilderment, and ignorance. At least at this very moment, every single one of them had basically lost the will and confidence to control their own lives. In reality, their fates of life and death depended on Luo Nan's will. It depended on a single thought. This included Kitano Sakudo, who had clenched his fists but couldn't find a target to exert his strength on. This head bodyguard stared blankly at Xia Hui on the back of the mountain. He looked at his temporary partner. Xia Hui held the Magatama that was no longer glowing. Xia Hui curled up on the ground. Xia Hui's aura was completely restrained and sealed. It was as if Xia Hui had been sealed into an invisible container. The connection between the inside and the outside was completely severed. This wasn't a knockdown or an extermination. This was a seal. In a way that he couldn't understand at all, this was a B-rank psychic. Kitano Sakudo didn't know what he was feeling right now. He turned to look at his employer and tried to converse with the soul deep within the frame of his body and soul. Don't go too far. The words squeezed out from his throat proved that this head bodyguard was completely at his wit's end. Was it too far? Of course, Luo Nan knew that Yukawa Aishuk's 7 orifices were bleeding. If it wasn't for the support of his will, Yukawa Aishuk's situation would have been even worse than Xia Hui on the ground. Luo Nan had forcefully reversed the structure of the Fusang tree just now, causing the power that Luo Nan transmitted to him to be a bit excessive. With the strength of Yukawa Aishuk's frame of body and soul, this wave of power was enough to cause serious injuries. But Luo Nan wasn't going to feel apologetic. If Yukawa Aishuk knew the role he should play in this world and stayed in his position, he might be able to live for a few more years. Under the influence of Luo Nan's will, Yukawa Aishuk's bloodshot and murky eyes adjusted slightly. He stared at Kitano Sakudo without saying a word. Kitano Sakudo's fleshy face twitched a few times. The ominous glint in his eyes finally dimmed. He waved his hand weakly. The 2 bodyguards who had been restraining Yukawa Aishuk's body were now stiff. They stared at their boss with wide eyes. When they saw the gesture, they felt as if they had been granted amnesty and quickly backed away. One of them even tripped over Xia Hui, who was on the ground, and almost fell down. Yukawa Aishuk slowly got up amidst this bewildered atmosphere. He bowed slightly to the people in the first-class cabin. Let's call it a day. My abrupt visit has caused inconvenience to everyone. Please forgive me. No. Please don't mind it. The Maikawa undersecretary made an example of himself. He bowed 90 degrees to Yukawa Aishuk. Please don't mind the dishonorable role I played in this incident. Yeah. Please don't mind it. You're too kind. I don't want to die. The first-class cabin was a boiling cauldron of voices. While everyone was expressing their stance or venting their emotions, Yukawa Aishuk's bloody and swollen face turned to the back. It was the entrance to the first-class cabin. Sir, you can't do this. You can't go up. The air stewardess's voice was urgent and trembling. It was rare for her to fulfill her duty, but it was pointless. The sealed partition door opened. A middle-aged man dressed in a suit and leather shoes walked in. He looked like a business elite. The man's face was flushed red. His feet were a bit floaty. It was as if he was drunk. However, his eyes were very bright. When he cast his gaze, it was as if the sun was shining down from the sky. Chapter 840. The drunk business elite pushed himself up from the VIP seat and moved over step by step. His fluttering footsteps and exceptionally bright eyes were completely different from normal, but he naturally formed an inexplicable harmony with the other abnormal creature on this side. At the same time, he also separated the other relatively normal fellows from him. It was this kind of situation that reduced the difficulty of understanding Yukawa Aishuk's nagging and complaints. A smart person like the Maeda vice officer of affairs instinctively discovered the conflicting and uneasy factors. But he couldn't retract his prawn-like body for a while. He awkwardly froze there. What was even worse was that Yukawa Aishuk and the others were in the middle of the first-class cabin. The drunkard who came up later had to pass by a group of people if he wanted to get there. This included the Maeda vice officer of affairs. The drunkard didn't give the Maeda vice officer of affairs a chance to think deeply before he passed by. He even said, "Excuse me." A surprisingly dry and hot palm pressed down on the former vice secretary of affairs' head, borrowing a little strength to continue moving forward. As for the former vice secretary of affairs, he had turned from a bent prawn into cooked prawn meat. His entire body was paralyzed on the ground, and he had lost consciousness. The sudden collapse of the Maeda vice officer of affairs didn't cause panic among the people around him. In fact, as these two extraordinary people gradually approached each other, any strange situation seemed to be within reason. Moreover, the drunkard was still talking, attracting most of the attention. My job is not up to standard. The number of devout believers is limited, and the ability users are even more scarce. Losing even one is a loss. Your drastic measures are very beautiful, but they are also giving me a difficult problem. His tone and wording were ordinary. Only the content of his words required others to think carefully. But even a person with a brain ischemia could understand at this time that another big shot had arrived. Yukawa Aishuk stood next to his seat. He stared at the newcomer and didn't say anything. He just sighed. On the other side, Bai Xinyan glanced at the unconscious mountebank Xia Hui on the ground. She didn't know the details of the drastic measures, but she could tell from common sense that the most suitable target for the new big shot's soul wasn't a business elite coming from business class. It was Xia Hui on the mountebank. These twists and turns only served to confirm that Luo Nan's methods were brilliant, and he possessed considerable foresight. Of course, if this big shot wanted to come over, it was impossible to stop him. At most, it would just be a few more unlucky people. The drunkard said something that seemed to be clear, but it wasn't. Then, he wandered off. It was not until then that the personal secretary of the Maikawa Vice Minister of Affairs had the courage to help his superior. But at this moment, he only lifted up a sleeve and half of the Vice Secretary of State Affairs, who was lying on the ground. The skin and flesh under the clothes seemed to have been put through several fires in a steamer, and the inside was almost melted. Ah! The sharp sound of the broken strings of reason turned into a screech of pain that came out of the secretary's throat. The future senior political official, who graduated from a first-class university, worked in a first-class department, and received first-class training, immediately peed his pants. His body bounced up a few centimeters and fell on the corpse of the Vice Minister of Maikawa. He lost consciousness. The screams, the strange smell, and the disfigured corpse. The sensory stimulation that came together and exploded in an instant finally tore apart the numb atmosphere caused by the high tension. No matter how strange the previous events were, they were far from being able to compare to the impact of the horror of death right before their eyes. The first-class cabin was in chaos. Almost everyone was retreating, fleeing, and running as far as they could. The relatively spacious first-class cabin was filled with a dozen headless flies. In other words, they could be ignored if they wanted to. After the drunkard touched the Maikawa Vice Minister of Affairs, he did not touch anyone else. It was as if the drunkard was just an accident. The drunkard smoothly made his way to the periphery of the small circle around Yukawa Aishuk. Most of the people in this circle were bodyguards. They were all professionals. They saw how this drunkard deprived the Maikawa Vice Minister of Affairs of his life, and now he was right in front of them. The more they understood the inconceivable things, the more they understood how terrifying this person, or the consciousness that was parasitic on this person's body, was. They also wanted to escape, but their leader, Kitano Sweto, did not respond. They hesitated and lost the chance to escape. They could only desperately shrink their bodies and try to put as much distance as possible between them and the drunkard. In this way, Yukawa Aishuk's protective wall was as good as non-existent. As the head of the bodyguards, Kitano Sweto still did not respond. In fact, he was probably one of the most dumbfounded people in the first-class cabin. When the drunkard was less than 2 meters away from him, he could already feel the abnormally high temperature. Only then did he wake up from his dream. He hurriedly and cautiously bowed. It's you? Kitano Sukito wasn't tall to begin with, and his bow made him even shorter. Therefore, the drunkard naturally ignored him, but his footsteps that had been moving forward also stopped there. There was no response from the other side. Kitano Sweto did not even dare to move his bent body. Not only him, but the people around him who had been influenced by what he saw and heard also instinctively bowed, each more obedient and humble than the last. There was also Bai Xinyan. She also bowed, her eyebrows drooping, and naturally held her breath. Outside the cabin, there was chaos as if a bomb had gone off, but inside the cabin, everyone was as silent as cicadas in winter. Between these two completely different scenes, the only similarity was probably the huge tension created by terror and absurdity, and the heart-wrenching pain that tore at people's hearts. Amidst the implicit and explicit agitation that tore at his heart, the drunkard spoke again. His tone was still very flat, but the information that came out of his mouth was like a flame that had finally burned through a curtain. It was a hot stream that rushed at his face. I am Hayaki. Kitano Sweto, Bai Xinyan, and the group of bodyguards subconsciously lowered their bodies a little more to show their reverence for this title. Yukawa Aishuk's mouth twitched. Hayaki. Pope. In the entire first-class cabin, only Yukawa Aishuk kept his body relatively straight. Of course, those who knew the truth knew that it was not the body that was straight, but the external soul that was supporting the body. The Pope of Hayaki, who had descended with the body of a believer, maintained a calm tone. It seemed that the slightest fluctuation could break the balance that had been maintained until now. Young man, you have a tendency to refuse communication. You are very hostile toward the Amaterasu order. The Pope of Hayaki was stating a fact. For the logic behind the fact to be established, more details needed to be filled in. This was equivalent to a kind of interrogation. So Yukawa Aishuk opened his mouth to say, hee. Luo Nan had no intention of responding. He just used Yukawa Aishuk's eyes and ears, as well as a wider and richer medium, to seriously observe and perceive, and to make adjustments. He adjusted himself to the best possible state. At this time, the first-class cabin that was hit by a terror bomb had already been lucky enough to rush out. But at the same time, they allowed the destruction of the terror bomb to spread to a larger area. Not a single person in the business or economy class was spared. Even the cockpit. The captain and the others should have already known about the unforeseen event that happened in the first-class cabin. They had not reacted before, but after a few minutes of delay, their reactions suddenly affected the entire airship. This colossus high up in the sky suddenly lowered its altitude and tilted. Although it quickly returned to normal, it still caused a group of people in the first-class cabin who did not have their seatbelts fastened to be in a rather sorry state. 2 bodyguards, who only cared about bowing, fell to the ground. They grabbed the handrails beside them with all their might to prevent themselves from crashing into the terrifying drunkard in front of them. At this moment, their hearts were about to explode. Bai Xinyan's body swayed, but she quickly regained her balance. She glanced outside the porthole. She didn't know when, but the airship had already sunk into the hazy layer of clouds. Smoke billowed outside the porthole, mixing with the curtain of night over the Pacific Ocean. As the 2 people at the center of the incident, whether it was Yukawa Aishuk or the drunkard, they were still mere mortals. They did not have the ability to take root in the swaying airship. During this period, they were swaying left and right, but there was still a conversation going on between them. It was mainly the Pope of Baiji who spoke. He even changed the direction of the conversation. Your spiritual configuration design is very good, but the spiritual realm is not a safe place. The higher you build now, the harder you will fall in the future. Is that so? Yukawa Aishuk replied casually. If the back of his head had not hit the outer shell of the space cabin next to him, he would have sounded more like a gentleman. The drunkard supported himself on the outer shell of the space cabin. He was barely able to maintain his image. At least his words were steady. Young people can be unscrupulous, but they should always think about the suffering in the future. As if you know anything. We can discuss and communicate. These people's original intentions were mostly the same, but they were too stupid and arrogant. Then, you are cunning and sinister, right? The airship returned to normal. Most of the people in the chaotic first-class cabin were still in a state of shock. The last round of dialogue, especially the one with the Pope of Baiji, had a seriously low intake and digestion. Comparatively speaking, Luo Nan had borrowed Yukawa Aishuk's mouth to reveal his emotions. They were very straightforward and easy to understand. It was very hard to accept. The other side was an extraordinary. Even though he had borrowed the power of his believers to descend in an incomplete form, his authority ranking in the inner world and the entire earth had been in the top 10 for many years. He was even in the top 5. This was especially true in the eyes of Kitano Sakudo and the other ability users who were registered in Sakura City. The Pope of Baiji and the Amaterasu order that he represented were like the vault of heaven that covered the skies above Sakura City. They were like the sun that brought about changes. Luo Nan's attitude, they could not see Luo Nan behind Yukawa Aishuk, but they could see that the drunkard, on the other side laughing softly. Oh my, can you tell? Yeah. Sakura City is too close. Yukawa Aishook's body fell to the ground as soon as he finished speaking. At the same time, the skies above the Pacific Ocean, which was supposed to be dark in the night, suddenly flashed with a powerful light. The light didn't fall from the sky, and it was as bright as day within a radius of hundreds of kilometers. Chapter 841. The airship in the stratosphere was in the nighttime region. It was pitch black outside, and there was nothing to see. Many passengers had taken off their sunshades, preparing to take a long nap and get used to the jet lag. At least, that was the case half a minute ago. The shock wave of the bomb of terror in the first-class cabin shattered the beautiful dreams of quite a few people. But what truly caused the passengers to wake up and go into an uproar was the endless, all-encompassing, unstoppable bright light. In this instant, it didn't matter if it was the thin sunshades or the thick outer shell of the airship. It didn't matter if it was the clear-headed eyewitnesses or the confused, frightened passengers. Everything was illuminated by the strong light. The inner walls of the outer shell, the skin, the bones, and the flesh, everything became transparent and even nothingness. Within the airship, all shadows were instantly swept away. Then what was erased were the differences between people, between objects, and even between objects. There were only panicked and petty souls that tumbled and screamed within the boundless strong light. Even though it was only for an instant, and it was like an illusion, it still exceeded the limits of what the vast majority of people could endure. The commotion on the airship got out of hand. Bai Xinyan still maintained her bowed posture, but she instinctively pulled in her shoulders and elbows. She shrunk a bit. As a woman, the feeling of being illuminated inside and out was truly terrible. But she could understand that this was the manifestation of the true gods of the Amaterasu order, the projection of power across space. It was just as the bastard who ran away said. This place wasn't that far from Ban City. 1,400 kilometers. As long as there was a tiny fulcrum, the two experts of the Amaterasu order could easily project their consciousness and power here. The only difference was the length of time and the intensity of the projection. Right now, it looked like the two of the Amaterasu order were yin and yang. One was restrained, and the other was unrestrained. Even the so-called restraint was only relative. In that case, had Luo Nan managed to escape from the pincer attack of the Pope of 100 Collections and true god Shinju? What do you think of this scene as compared to a daydream? A flat voice came into her ears. It didn't even bother to raise the question. It was because the voice was too flat that Bai Xinyan was unable to understand it immediately. She subconsciously asked. What? Only then did she realize that the person who had just spoken to her was the Pope of the 100 Communities. The second in command of the Amaterasu cult, who had descended from the sky, manipulated the puppet, which was obviously unwieldy, to raise its wrist to look at its watch. There was indeed a watch on the puppet's wrist, and it showed the time in Osaka. 22:17:45. After confirming the time, the Pope finally moved the puppet and continued to move forward. He passed by a few trembling bodyguards, as well as Yukawa Aisuk and Yamakabe Xia Hui, who had fallen to the ground. Finally, he adjusted his posture and sat on the seat that Yukawa Aisuk was sitting on. After sitting down, he no longer had to worry about maintaining his balance. His body language was more relaxed, and he was more like the one Bai Xinyan was familiar with, except for his face. While Bai Xinyan was evaluating the situation in her mind, the gaze from the other side was cast over again. Bai Xinyan also remembered that she had not yet answered the question of the Pope of Baiji. She tried to organize her words, but the other side asked again without a care in the world, I mean, Chiji's move just now, how is it different from the feeling of the white nightmare a few days ago? Bai Xinyan seemed to be able to hear the sound of the bodyguard's waist bones and knees cracking. She could almost hear the sound of the bodyguard's waist bones and knees cracking. Bai Xinyan was no longer surprised. She just couldn't understand why the Pope of the 100 Assemblies would suddenly ask such a completely unrelated question. The White Nightmare, May 7th, Osaka time, was an accident that affected the entire world. It was still rippling across the Pacific Ocean to this day, and was still in the ascendant. Because she was in the Eastern Hemisphere at that time, Bai Xinyan did not feel too much about it. Presumably, the Pope of the 100 Communities also knew. He was probably asking for the opinion of the person behind her. Bai Xinyan suddenly realized that she needed to adjust the priority of the White Nightmare incident. For the Pope of the 100 Communities to specifically ask about it, the impact on the inner world was no different from the Light of the Polar Domain incident at the end of last year. However, the Pope of the 100 Communities was destined to be disappointed. Bai Xinyan bowed and replied, "Xinyan's skills are insufficient, and my memory of that day is also blurred. It's difficult to compare." The Pope of the 100 Communities did not show any obvious disappointment or anger. Even if there was, it would not show on the puppet's face. In the time it took for these 2 or 3 sentences to be exchanged, the powerful light that illuminated everything had already disappeared. The outside of the porthole was still bright, as if they could no longer return to the natural nighttime. However, under the illumination of the bright light, the roiling clouds in the sky seemed to be even denser. Even though they were illuminated by the strong light, they still slapped against the porthole, changing shape and reminding people they were still tens of thousands of feet high in the sky, still one of the areas with the densest concentration of water vapor in the world. Bai Xinyan noticed the changes outside the porthole, and unconsciously became somewhat absent-minded. Up until now, this area had not experienced too obvious of an impact or turbulence, but just by looking at the interaction between the strong light and the sea of clouds, she could draw some conclusions and judgments. At this moment, she heard the Pope of the 100 Communities sigh, the condensation ring, truly a divine technique that should not have appeared on Earth. Bai Xinyan shivered slightly and turned her gaze back, just in time to see the slightly red eyes of the Pope of the 100 Communities puppets. The latter swept a glance over her body, but finally focused on her side. Bai Xinyan subconsciously followed the Pope of the 100 Communities' focus, and her gaze fell on her own feet. It was a suitcase that was lying flat in front of her seat. This thing was originally placed neatly on the inside of the seat, but because the airship had lost its balance and was in the process of righting itself, it had fallen out. "This is a mimicry generator." The Pope of the 100 Communities' voice was very certain, and he even used the puppet's toe to kick the unconscious Yukawa Isuke on the ground. He made a last-minute report, but there was no follow-up. His intentions are clear as day. Next to him, Kitano Sakito's eyelids were already twitching because of the Pope of the 100 Communities' actions, and he unconsciously shivered when he heard this. He opened his mouth to explain, but his mouth opened and closed a few times, but he did not have the strength to make a sound. Bai Xinyan, on the other hand, smiled. Otherwise, he would say that His Majesty is magnanimous. As soon as she finished speaking, the torrential rain and distorted light slapped against the porthole and the outer armor of the airship. In response, there was a dull explosion outside, and the hoarse noise of the airship's structure creaking and disorderly. The people on the airship could even feel the obvious drift. The surging force in the strong light and clouds pushed the airship sideways for some distance. There was no doubt that from the cockpit to the economy cabin, there was another wave of exclamations and howls. The Pope of the 100 Communities looked at his watch again. 20 minutes and 4 seconds. "Turn it on, we'll take a look." Chapter 842. This? Isn't that inappropriate? Bai Xinyan did not refuse. She was just puzzled. Regardless of how Luo Nan managed to deal with the encirclement and interception of true gods for over 2 minutes, it was easy to imagine that the area where the two sides wrestled was not on the material plane. On the mental plane, it was undoubtedly the Abyss region. The mimicry map generator produced a mimicry map of the mental sea. As its name implied, it could only be used in the mental sea. There was an insurmountable distance between it and the main battlefield in the Abyss region. Moreover, this was just a simulator. The lag was quite strong. It was not suitable for use in actual combat. The Pope of Chiji did not speak again. He just used the puppet's scarlet eye to cut across Bai Xinyan's face. Bai Xinyan was not going to be stubborn about this issue. She shrugged, bent over, and placed the suitcase back on the seat. She opened the suitcase, turned it on, and connected it to the projector. It was certainly not as effective as the one on Aishook Yukawa's private airship, but the dense bubble scene still appeared. Bai Xinyan swept her eyes over the various parameters displayed in the projection area. She spoke truthfully, the debugging will take some time. There was another part of her that she did not say. Perhaps this high-level interception battle would have ended before the debugging was completed. The Pope of Chiji still did not speak. The puppet that carried his consciousness even narrowed its eyes. It looked like it was taking a nap. Of course, it was more likely that it was sensing the situation of the battle outside the airship. Bai Xinyan's communication was fruitless. She could only settle her mind and proceed with the debugging process bit by bit. But just as she said, this was not a problem that could be solved in a minute or two. On the other hand, the curtain of intense light outside the airship grew more and more intense. Faint rumbling sounds of thunder could be heard. At first, it sounded like it was hundreds of kilometers away, but in the blink of an eye, it was within reach. It shook the airship's window until it hummed. It seemed as if it would collapse and disintegrate in the next moment. It's been over 3 minutes. Bai Xinyan paid more attention to the battle outside. At first glance, the momentum of this battle was astonishing, but in fact, in terms of intensity, it was far from the strongest. The rhythm of the explosions was intermittent, and there was a high probability that it was a chase, but once the chase started, it would be endless. Was there a limit to being a true god? Or was Luo Nan too cunning? Or perhaps... You haven't finished debugging yet? The one who spoke was Kitano Sakuto. The head bodyguard walked over quietly and spoke in a low voice. His original tough and professional demeanor was almost gone. Without the hint from the Pope of Hyakanji, Kitano Sakuto would not have come here just to investigate. After all, it was just a matter of opening his mouth. Did the Pope of Hyakanji need to put on airs like this? Bai Xinyan's drifting consciousness came back. She turned around to see what was going on. However, Kitano Sakuto happened to block her line of sight. She could only exchange glances with Kitano Sakuto and shake her head slightly, signaling him to pay attention to the surrounding environment. At this time, the cries from the business class and economy class had vaguely spread to the upper deck. Along with the shapeless corpses and unconscious and limp bodies, it looked like a scene from the end of the world. The collective emotional state is in a mess, and the spiritual sea is in chaos. The changes are too intense. Moreover, the computing power of a portable instrument is difficult to support the speed and precision of analysis at the same time. It's not suitable for actual combat. This was said to Kitano Sakuto, but it was also an explanation for the Pope of Hakuji. I'll bring it over. Huh? Bai Xinyan did not understand at first. Kitano Sakuto's eyelids drooped, and his eyes were almost invisible, but his movements were direct and clear. He reached out and picked up the mimicry generator that was still in a state of adjustment. He held it up respectfully, turned around, and took 2 steps to present it to the Pope. At this time, Bai Xinyan finally saw the current state of the Pope of Hakuji. The puppet that he had possessed was sitting in a somewhat casual posture. His legs were spread wide, his elbows on his knees, and his upper body was supported. However, the curve of his back was still bent, and his head was also drooping. His right hand naturally clasped his left wrist, and his fingertips tapped unconsciously on his wrist. He looked like he was thinking, but also looked a little tired. As for the mimicry generator that was already in his hand, he did not pay attention to it immediately. He still maintained his posture, and no one knew what he was thinking. Compared to the image of a god and its spokesperson that could not be looked at directly and could not be communicated with, this kind of behavior that was similar to a real life was more or less a buffer for the fragile hearts of the surrounding bodyguards. Therefore, probably because of Kitano Sakuto's arrangement, the bodyguards began to work. They were trying to settle Yukawa Aisuk and Yamashita Xiaohui, who were stacked together at the feet of the Pope of Hakuji. At present, they had already carried Yukawa Aisuk away and placed him on the front row seat. They were about to carry Yamashita Xiaohui away when the tip of a polished leather boot suddenly tapped on his side shoulder. The leather boot belonged to the Pope of Hakuji. Puppet. Stop. Kitano Sakuto, who was still holding the mimicry generator, reacted quickly and called for it to stop immediately. Everyone's movements froze for a moment. Only the Pope of Hakuji controlled the puppet to extend its hand and use it to replace the tip of the boot to press on Yamashita Xiaohui's shoulder. Bai Xinyan narrowed her eyes. Although the entire process was not long, she could see, and the others could also see, that the Pope puppet's fingertip was clearly trembling. Even when it pressed on Yamashita Xiaohui's shoulder, it only calmed down a little. She roughly understood why the Pope of Hakuji was putting on airs. For an extraordinary, high-intensity output from more than 1,400 kilometers away was not that easy to deal with. Without a solid fulcrum, the puppet had strength but was unable to use it. It also needed to perform micromanipulation to avoid bursting the small water pipe. From this, it could be seen that the majority of the Pope of Hakuji's energy was consumed on this. Even so, the problem of accelerated depreciation was unavoidable. The puppet's outstretched hand maintained a pressing posture on Yamashita Xiaohui's shoulder for over 10 seconds. During this time, the puppet's skin was clearly red. Fine sweat seeped out of its pores, and there were even faint specks of blood. It was only because the puppet had a drunken appearance that it was not overly eye-catching. But even with such strength, Yamashita Xiaohui didn't show any reaction. This technique. Bai Xinyan lowered her eyes. She made a hypothesis based on this. If the Pope of Hakuji had the support of a B-rank psychic like Yamashita Xiaohui, then the Pope of Hakuji would certainly be much more relaxed than he was right now. But Yamashita Xiaohui had fainted, and he seemed to be quite heavy. It was hard to say who would be at a disadvantage if they were to fight a protracted battle like this. TSK. Luo Nan's grasp of the situation and his control of the details was much more experienced than imagined. It was as if he was exchanging blows with extraordinaries from time to time. Where did he accumulate this experience and insight from? At this time, Bai Xinyan heard the puppet's breathing. It was as if there was a tube of iron sand in its throat, making a rustling sound. She relied on her many years of experience in researching the human body. Her first judgment was that Xiaohui had developed severe symptoms of laryngeal edema. Eliminating the cause of infection, his heart and kidney functions were most likely abnormal. Under the strong pressure, the internal organs of the human body had suffered irreversible damage, and the damage was continuing to worsen. There was no possibility of relief. Bai Xinyan was able to discern so much information due to her personal ability level. The others didn't have this ability. They could only passively wait. In particular, the bodyguard who was preparing to move Yamashita Xiaohui maintained a half-squatting posture. He didn't dare to move. He waited for over 10 seconds, and all he got was the Pope puppet's sigh. He felt a dry sensation suddenly press against the top of his head. He seemed to hear a cry of alarm, or perhaps it was the sound of the explosion outside the window. Then, it was meaningless to him. All sounds in the first-class cabin disappeared. The Pope puppet's sigh also disappeared. At the same time, the symptoms of laryngeal edema also disappeared. At the very least, it was temporarily alleviated. The price was the bodyguard who had fallen onto Yamashita Xiaohui. That person's skin and flesh were already limp. There was no breath left. The way he died was no different from the Maikawa Vice Minister of Affairs. The surrounding bodyguards all had deathly pale faces. As full-time members of the Yuchuan family, they had seen quite a few situations of internal handling. But this kind of situation where they were treated as a power bank was truly unprecedented. The important question was, whose turn would it be next? The hearts of the people were in turmoil, but now was not the time to pacify them. Whether it was Bai Xinyan or Kitano Sukido, neither of them cared about these things. From their perspective, what they needed to pay more attention to was the new clear instructions the Pope of Hundred Gatherings made after helping the puppet catch its breath. The hand that had just reaped a life flipped over. Its palm faced upwards, and it hooked its finger. Kitano Sukido's reaction was maintained at a high standard. He bent down again and, with absolute respect, handed over the mimicry generator. It was also at this time that he saw a cluster of greenish-black veins appear on the palm. It looked like the expanding capillaries under the skin, but it was more like the shadow of a tree with branches growing horizontally. Within the dark veins, there was clearly light flowing, filled with a different kind of vitality. But just thinking about its most likely source made one shudder. Kitano Sukito instinctively wanted to keep his distance from the Pope puppet. He wanted to retreat after completing his task. But the latter had no intention of taking over. Perhaps it felt that the distance and height were just right, so it simply used Kitano Sukito as a table. It stretched its hand over the control area of the device and began to operate it. Huh! Kitano Sukito's pupils dilated as he watched the Pope puppet's fingertips switch back and forth between the virtual interface and the physical buttons. Especially with the appearance of a business elite, he looked quite professional when he did such actions. But as long as one thought about the true identity, status, and image of the Pope, there was an element of absurdity in it. And as the Pope puppet operated, the mimicry image of the spiritual C, in the projection area connected to the device began to change repeatedly. The colorful, water droplets constantly adjusted the angle of presentation, and at the same time, the colors quickly faded, forming a general grayish-white base tone. Kitano Sukito did not quite understand what this change meant. He subconsciously turned to look at Bai Xinyan, but he saw that Bai Xinyan's gaze had drifted to Yukawa Aishuk, who had just been seated in the front row. Bai Xinyan also noticed Kitano Sukito's gaze, but she had no intention of explaining. She moved her gaze away from Yukawa Aishuk and switched back and forth between the device and the projection area. She knew, and she had even explained to Yukawa Aishuk earlier, that this kind of change was a result of the repetitive spiritual waves in the surrounding area and the changes that had already become a routine. It was presented as the regular background radiation. This was also a sign that the initial analysis of the mimicry picture had been completed. Last time in Osaka, Bai Xinyan had spent at least 20 minutes to achieve this step. Even if the sensing range was wider this time, and the processing of more data, the difference was too obvious in comparison. Bai Xinyan could confirm that this device was directly sent over from the deep blue world. It was a product of the laboratory, and it had not been put into the market. Perhaps this was the only one on Earth. Then, where did the super operating ability of the Pope of the 100 Collections come from? Was it born with knowledge? Such thoughts could be written into the scriptures of the Church, but in the real world, it was better to use reasoning. From the simple background of the device, if the problem was not in the application or the circulation, then the problem could only be in the research and development stage. According to her understanding, the Apocalypse Laboratory had obtained inspiration from Luo Nan's cage theory to develop this device. They hoped to use it as a key tool to break the barriers that ordinary people had to the spiritual plane. They wanted to make it into a commercial hit and lay the foundation for the next step of their grand plan. The so-called return on investment, the small profit operation, and the like were just excuses to deal with investors like Yukawa Aishuk. As for what the grand plan was, Bai Xinyan did not know the full picture. She only heard that the laboratory attached great importance to it, and that even Li Wei was deeply involved in the research and development. But now it seemed that Li Wei was not the only one participating in the research and development. The relationship between the Apocalypse Laboratory and the Amaterasu Order was no longer concealed. Yukawa Aishuk had indeed played the worst trick. Focus. A low and hoarse voice flowed out from the throat of the Pope puppet. It was directed at Bai Xinyan. Your Majesty. You'll be the one operating from now on. Make sure that the interface is maintained on this baseline. The Pope puppet did not even raise its head. The arrangement was a matter of course. The slight loss of voice at the end proved that the organ tissue of the throat had not completely recovered. It was impossible for it to recover. It was only a matter of time before it collapsed. Perhaps it was because of this that the Pope of the 100 Collections did not play any tricks. She spoke very clearly. Qianju exerts force through the abyss region. Distance isn't a problem, but it is very difficult to accurately lock onto Luo Nan. Luo Nan previously reversed sealed the Magatama configuration and Xia Hui on the back of the mountain, cutting off our path of descent. His methods are brilliant, but it is hard to avoid revealing traces. We have grabbed onto a piece of his tail, but it is too insubstantial. It jumps back and forth between the material plane and the mental plane. Qianzhu probed down from the abyss region to the material plane, causing a large loss in precision. He needs me to act as the signal tower's relay gain. Only then can he encircle and intercept Luonan. Luonan knows all of this. He will most likely do something. The Pope of the 100 Collections operated the apparatus as she explained. In this way, Bai Xinyan had a clear understanding of the distorted bubbles of colorful light that gradually grew on the ash-gray background. Frankly speaking, it was a nesting doll structure. The innermost layer of the bubble was the signal tower of the Pope puppet. It appeared weak and fleeting, as if it could collapse at any time. The middle layer warped and fluctuated, flickering indefinitely. Specks of light would appear from time to time, but they did not form a shape. This was most likely the impact of the battle between the two sides. The details were no longer something that the mimicry diagram could analyze. The outermost layer was supported by a bubble. This bubble was much more stable, forming a boundary that was not a boundary. Perhaps, this was the control domain of a true god's extraordinary power? Of course, everything displayed here was just a mimicry on the mental C-plane. Let's not talk about accuracy. In essence, it was just the area swept by the aftermath. The main battlefield between Luonan and a true god was still the abyss region. Understand? His Majesty is using himself as bait? Bai Xinyan was just being polite. The Pope had only used a pious believer puppet. It was not even an ability user. How could it be considered bait? If Luonan really wanted to pull the firewood out from the bottom of the cauldron, then the true unlucky ones would be them, the passengers of the airship, if there was a slight deviation in the application of power. However, this possibility was meaningless to the Pope of the 100 Collections. What he paid attention to was on a completely different level than the others. The puppet raised its head and stared at Bai Xinyan with its scarlet eyes. Protect the apparatus. Collect data. If Qianzhu is unable to obtain the results of the battle, this place needs to be maintained for at least 200 seconds. The mimicry generator will transmit the data to the laboratory's cloud. We need to clearly see his foundation. We need to clearly see what he's hiding behind his back. Yes. Bai Xinyan agreed. But she had a feeling that the Pope of the 100 Collections was not talking to her. Instead, he was shouting at Luonan, whose whereabouts were unknown within the boundless clouds. It was like a threat, but it was also like a lure. Chapter 843. Yinlu arrived at Luonan's rented studio on the dot. Even though Luonan hadn't had a normal work and rest schedule for several days in a row, as long as she was his personal secretary, she absolutely couldn't neglect the morning and evening work. She first pressed the intercom outside the workshop, but there was no response. Only then did she verify her fingerprint to enter. The lights of the workshop were on, and the lights and shadows of the virtual work area were fluctuating. Luonan sat behind the workbench with one hand supporting his cheek. His figure was frozen. He should be concentrating on his work. However, when he took 2 more steps forward and took a closer look, he discovered that the man's eyes were closed and his breathing was slow. He had actually fallen asleep while maintaining this posture. He probably couldn't take it anymore after working continuously. Yinlu didn't dare to wake Luonan up. She just scanned the workshop to see if there was anything that needed to be cleaned up. That moving shelf didn't exist before. Now, it was placed in the middle of the room. It was very conspicuous. Something must have been placed there earlier. It was likely that the veteran had been here before. Yinlu moved the mobile rack to the corner and quietly walked to the workbench. She didn't dare to touch the tools and instruments on the stage. She could only pick up some small things and even took photos to locate them. She didn't want anything to go wrong and she couldn't recover them. It was also at this time that she glanced at the virtual work area. The picture she saw was very familiar. It was like a bottomless sea, or a storm on the surface of the sea. It was thick and colorful, and the structure was chaotic. In fact, it was made up of 2 overlapping pictures. 2 psychic diagrams. The reason why Yin-Lo was certain of this was because she had seen Luo Nan dismantle and integrate before. Moreover, most of the things she had been busy with recently came from this. It was hard for Yin-Lo to notice such a complicated and profound diagram. However, she noticed that the whole picture was fluctuating rhythmically, as if it was an interwoven picture of the ocean that was gradually seeping into the real world and becoming a substantial existence. Yin-Lo was startled, but she soon realized that it might be a misconception. This was because there was a certain amount of distortion and refraction of light in the surroundings of the sleeping Luo Nan. Upon closer inspection, it was clear that the air was fluctuating, resulting in an illusion. Luo Nan wasn't resting. He was cultivating, right? Was there a need to be so desperate? Yin-Lo couldn't help but recall the letter she had sent to Mrs. Halder, which described her doubts and judgment. Luo Nan, this new boss of hers, had his sights set on the target. The enemy he targeted far exceeded the scope of what should have been. This forced him to never stop moving forward. Instead, he seized every moment and opportunity to improve himself. He was as taut as a humming bowstring. He might shoot a deadly arrow at any time, but he might also snap on his own. Yin-Lo sighed. Her breath was still lingering in her mouth when a rustling sound rang out at the same time. Behind the workbench, the chair on Luo Nan's body suddenly collapsed without any warning. The wooden body of the chair and the soft cushion on the seat disintegrated into fine dust, and some of the plastic and metal parts were twisted and cracked. At the same time, they were restrained by a certain force, which erased the kinetic energy of the disintegration. They fell in a straight line and fell to the ground. Yin-Lo was startled. "Sir." The moment she spoke those words, she felt that there were too many similar exclamations. But when the impact came, what could she do? And this time, the shout had some effect. Luo Nan opened his eyes at this time. As for his body, it floated in midair, maintaining its original natural state without any undulation. "Sir?" Yin-Lo called out in a probing manner. "Oh, you're here." Luo Nan looked as if he had just woken up. He floated in midair, unfolded his body, and stretched his waist. But his eyes were as bright as stars. He didn't have the hazy appearance of someone who had just woken up. Yin-Lo was very curious as to what Luo Nan had been doing, but she couldn't really ask. She could only go with the flow and say, "It's almost 10:30. "Sir, do you want to go back and rest?" "Oh, it doesn't matter if I rest or not. I can't stay here for now." It wasn't easy to calibrate the equipment. "I might have to start all over again." "Really?" Yin-Lo responded with her mouth, but in her mind, she thought of the fluctuating air around Luo Nan. Luo Nan's feet didn't touch the ground. His body turned a few times, and he sat on the wheelchair next to the workbench. He entered into the disabled mode, which required someone to serve him. Yin-Li's eyes were still engraved with the image of his natural turning and turning, of his figure that didn't have the slightest trace of smoke and fire. It was unknown how much more brilliant it was than when he used the electromagnetic configuration to propel his fleshly body to float in midair. But when she thought about it in detail, only 2 weeks had passed in between. This degree of improvement. Yin-Lo sighed silently. She consciously went behind the wheelchair and did what she needed to do. But when she exerted force, the wheelchair actually became heavy and sluggish. It didn't move at all. "What's wrong with this? I almost forgot. I can't take a car in my current situation. Let's walk back." "What's your situation?" Yin-Lo finally found the opportunity to seek knowledge and dispel her doubts. She subconsciously made a guess. "Did you have another breakthrough in your cultivation?" "Nope. I was just playing a game." "You can't take it seriously." Yin-Lo was at a loss out of habit. The wheelchair beneath Luo Nan didn't need her to exert force at this time. It automatically moved forward and left the room. Yin-Lo hurried to catch up. She could confirm that this wasn't the work of the motor built into the wheelchair. Luo Nan ignored the commercial car parked outside after leaving the workshop. He directly controlled the wheelchair to move forward. Enlu arranged for the driver to go ahead first. She walked with small steps in her high heels. She followed behind him with clattering sounds. It was close to midnight in the Ping trade market. Even in the central area, there were very few pedestrians. The streets were empty, looking quite refreshing. But Luo Nan said, "How impatient." He narrowed his eyes as he spoke. A portion of the soul cloak spread out for thousands of kilometers, tens of thousands of kilometers. Hot bubbles bulged out from the intense light and high temperature. It was like a blazing furnace, roasting the slight fishy smell of the clouds and sea into a complex sensory stimulation. It was transmitted over a distance of 1,500 kilometers. He sensed it, experienced it, and responded to it. Of course, it was just as Luo Nan said. This series of senses was more like the stimulation of a virtual game, and it was a low degree of simulation. It was a bit like the déjà vu of an external neuron taking an offline test. He wasn't even as nervous as he was back then. If he didn't pass the test, he would most likely be in big trouble. Right now, the soul cloak was restraining and resisting him. He was playing hide-and-seek with a true god in the abyssal region. He arranged a few configurations within the clouds and watched them live and die. He didn't care much about winning or losing. It was just like the Pope of 100 Collections, who claimed to use her body as bait. What tense situation. It was all just talk. How could he be taken seriously? Well, for Bai Xinyan and the other people involved, this wasn't wrong. Only Luo Nan wouldn't. He couldn't do this. Chapter 844. The distance from the studio located at the center of the peaceful trade market to the yacht dock was approximately 5 kilometers. Whether it was Luo Nan or Enlu, neither of them took this distance seriously. The two slowly walked forward, one in front and one behind, amidst the sound of rubber wheels and high heels hitting the road surface. Enlu still did not understand Luo Nan's words. However, as they walked, she naturally assumed the position of a personal secretary. She held the handle behind the wheelchair, even though it did not have any practical meaning. Enlu was still pondering over Luo Nan's theory of playing games. She could not understand the logic behind it no matter how hard she tried. She pondered for a kilometer before she heard Luo Nan's voice. "You were once the manager of Frost River Reality. How do you deal with those guys who cheat in games?" This. How do you deal with those guys who cheat and want to PK with real people? Enlu stared blankly for a few seconds before she finally decided to say what was on her mind. Basically, you deal with them by suspending their accounts. In some cases, you'll use security and the police. Sometimes, you'll even apply to the SCA to lower the social privileges of those people. You'll ban them from entering relevant places and so on. Heh. It's quite difficult to find the SCA at that level. Luo Nan laughed and sighed. It was just as he said. Right now, he was playing a game. When it came to game skills, he and the two from the Amaterasu order could not determine who was superior due to the short amount of time they had spent together. However, Luo Nan occupied two advantages. One was the advantage of misplaced information. Luo Nan knew how the true god and the Pope participated. He knew their methods and calculations. Though those two had locked onto a Luo Nan, it was only an illusory phantom. An enormous error had appeared in their critical judgment. The other advantage was the bandwidth advantage. Luo Nan relied on the ability of the soul cloak to cover the entire world. He occupied an absolute advantage in terms of energy conduction and utilization. He also sealed off the preset signal tower a step earlier. While the true god and the Pope were still calculating whether or not there was a signal, Luo Nan relied on the ubiquitous water molecules to construct the global Internet of Things. He enjoyed the convenience of zero-time delay. Luo Nan did not know how he would lose if he simply played games under these conditions. The problem lay in the fact that the Pope and the true god were sore losers. They didn't really want to PK with Luo Nan's gaming techniques. Their goal from the very beginning was to lock onto Luo Nan's position in reality through the game within the clouds. This was to prepare for the offline real-life PK. This was very shameless. From Luo Nan's perspective, it didn't matter whether he won or lost the game. In any case, he had already achieved his goal of warning by Xinyan and Yukawa Aishuk. But if the two from the Amaterasu order locked onto Luo Nan's true location and confirmed that the target was hiding in their base, they would not be able to win. Yin Lu and Snake Tongue, who were by Luo Nan's side, as well as Old Hand and the group of vagrants who had a close relationship with Luo Nan's grandfather, would most likely not be able to survive once the conflict erupted. From another point of view, the reason why the true gods and the Pope still had some misgivings in their headquarters, Ban City, and had to travel over 1,000 kilometers to verify their findings was also because of the existence of the source of interference. In their eyes, there should be a difference between Luo Nan and the source of interference. Especially since Luo Nan was following closely behind the airship. The influence of the spacetime interference still existed in Ban City. This was more or less a new piece of evidence. At the very least, they did not think that there was no human figure riding a devil ray running and hiding in the hazy sea and sky 1,500 kilometers away. Even if they had their suspicions, they still needed further confirmation. With this analysis, the things Luo Nan needed to do were quite clear. He needed to maintain his advantage. He needed to interfere with the verification methods of the true God and the Pope. He needed to let the existing misunderstanding continue to exist. It would be best if he stayed away from reality and created layers of confusion. He needed to lure the two off topic and have some fear. Of course, he absolutely could not overreach himself and allow the other side to grab hold of his weakness. Luo Nan was very cautious. It was true that he occupied a certain information advantage. But ultimately, he was not sure what the two from the Amaterasu order were basing their judgment on. He did not know where they came from. Especially the true God who had run back to Ban City after screaming out that his soul had been magnetized. His understanding of the situation definitely exceeded the scope of normal Earth knowledge. Luo Nan wanted to think things over carefully, but this was not something he was good at. He could not find anyone to advise him. The conversation with Yin Lu just now was just a joke to adjust his mood. This was the result of stuffing a belly full of secrets. Luckily, the conversation between the Pope and Bai Xinyan gave Luo Nan an opening to take advantage of the situation. Didn't they say that I was nearby? Then I'll be nearby. He would not be able to hide it sooner or later if he just fooled around in the air. He needed to add a bit more to it. During the night stroll, Luo Nan carefully combed through his thoughts in his mind. He roughly sorted out the required configuration design. Then he extended his hand and waved behind him. You still have the one I gave you last time, right? Huh? Yin Lu, who had been stunned by Luo Nan's question, instantly became nervous. Mister, which one are you talking about? It's that fish. Luo Nan subconsciously lowered his voice when he said the three key syllables. He was a bit mysterious. The Devil Ray was a secret that absolutely could not be exposed in Ban City. Yin Lu had a serious expression. She had never seen Luo Nan speak with this sort of tone before. Many thoughts flashed through her mind in an instant. She calmed her mind with great difficulty and lowered her voice. Yes, mister. You. Luo Nan didn't say much. He just waved his 5 fingers. His meaning was very clear. Yin Lu immediately picked up her bag and wanted to take out the crystal ball, with the devil ray sealed inside. But her vigilant mentality made her remember something. She hesitated for a moment before handing over the entire purse. Her body leaned forward, and her lips nearly stuck to Luo Nan's ear as she apologized. I'll have to trouble mister to take a look. Don't take it out for now. I've had a lot of eyes these past 2 days. Oh, that's right. The Deep Blue Walker Squadron, which was his yacht's neighbor, had put in quite a bit of effort these past few days. It was a bit better in the studio, but in a public place, there might be several surveillance cameras pointing at them. It's too early to talk about this. Luo Nan reflected on himself for a moment. He readily followed the advice and opened the purse to search for his target. From his perspective, the lady's purse was more or less a small maze. He could clearly sense the location of the crystal ball, but the complicated design of the purse still tormented him quite a bit. A minute later, Luo Nan extended his hand into the Kuan bag and finally grasped the crystal ball. He felt the marvelous sensation of the crystal ball being indistinguishable between real and illusory. He also felt the instant information that belonged to the devil ray transmitted from the void in between layers. He made a series of fine adjustments to the configuration outline in his mind. Chapter 845. What are these B** stars doing? Captain Jimmy crossed his arms in front of his chest and subconsciously tapped his feet. The rapid rhythm reflected his current terrible mood. At this time, he was supposed to be preparing for tonight's operation, but an unexpected incident had ruined all his preparations. The surveillance resources that had been fully activated had been reduced to something akin to catching an adulterer in the act. For the time being, no one could give him a response. From his deputy, Mendez, to the surrounding members of the action team, and the SCA officials who had just rushed over to work overtime but were proven to be a waste of time, they all averted their gazes to avoid the unfortunate incident. 2 minutes ago, a video from an intercontinental passenger airship began to spread on the internet. The suspected terrorist attack that happened in the first-class cabin of the airship was recorded from different angles by many witnesses, posted on different social media accounts, and linked with big data. It began to rapidly accumulate views and influence. Until now, there was still no clear explanation for the incident. In fact, even if a nuclear bomb exploded on the airship, Captain Jimmy would not care. The key problem was that Bai Xinyan, who was at the last point of the parallel approval process, was in the area where the incident occurred, and there was still no news of her. The operation approval process was once again stuck. Captain Jimmy felt like he was tripped. It did not hurt him, but it was very depressing. The mission against the remnants of the Soul cult was actually not difficult, nor was it urgent or challenging. The reason why Captain Jimmy could not forget about it was largely because he wanted to compete with Bai Xinyan. He did not deny this. He finally had the opportunity to use the situation and the procedure to force Bai Xinyan to yield. Victory was in sight, but something like this happened. What kind of luck did Bai Xinyan have? Whether it was reasonable or not, that was what Captain Jimmy thought in his heart. The procedure went into a standstill again. Captain Jimmy had no choice but to pay attention to the development of the incident and try to learn the truth from the higher-ups. At the same time, he diverted some attention to the B** starred couple on the street. No matter what, these two were the people who had the most contact with the target, the veteran, Shou Xiong, and the other vagrants. In other words, they were also suspects, even if they had the blood flame order behind them. Captain Jimmy kicked the chair under the intelligence officers and tried to make his subordinates nervous again. Give me the plan. The one numbered A7. To deal with indirect suspects like Mr. M.O., whose background was clear but whose identity was unknown, the operation team also had a contingency plan. When the captain had nothing to do, he could go on a vacation. The bitter intelligence and staff officers could only crawl on the grid and write plans to satisfy the captain's desire to dominate. Jimmy, let's wait for the news. Seeing Captain Jimmy's behavior, Mender knew that Captain Jimmy wanted to take a different approach. Therefore, he tried to dissuade him. There should be a result on the airship soon. I'm just waiting and making preparations. In front of his subordinates, Captain Jimmy maintained the dignity of a supervisor. Even if the procedure is completed and we start to move, from the close contact between this adulterous couple and Shou Xiong, there is a high chance that they will interfere. Look, that woman is on the phone, talking to her lover. Boy, show me the surveillance records from the past few days. The last sentence was again addressed to the intelligence clerk. While retrieving the information, Captain Jimmy said to the SCA's Minister O'Hara, "It would be perfect if we could get their phone records." Minister O'Hara's mouth twitched, but he didn't respond to Captain Jimmy's words and actions that violated the law. He could only pretend that he was deaf and mute. Captain Jimmy didn't force him further. Now wasn't the time to be serious. He only compared the surveillance records to find evidence for himself. From the surveillance records, our technical maniac, Mr. Mo, has been working hard in the studio for the past few days. Why couldn't he stay there tonight? Oh, and the big news on the airship just happened. Alright, Captain Jimmy's every word exuded an aura of looking for trouble. This was already the consensus of everyone present, but no one dared to point it out. Captain Jimmy, on the other hand, felt good about it, so his words became more and more outrageous. This Mr. Mo, T-City still hasn't found an accurate explanation for why the Blood Flame Order's deputy high priest is so willing to be submissive. Is he actually Lady Halder's lover, or is he the result of that person's sex change? Cough, cough. With outsiders around, Dor didn't want to speak carelessly and leave something that could be used against him. He tried his best to find more information. From the intelligence, the Blood Flame Order's madam has always been cold and ruthless. She's also a bit mysterious. Maybe this is her backup plan. Backup plan? She has such a high-profile backup plan? It's not that bad. Anyone under the spotlight has to expose something. Then what did he expose? Claw Island. Buddy, do you remember that place? Yes. In the few days that the operation had been stalled, the operation team could only put in more effort into intelligence work. So far, they had already obtained enough information from Mr. Neo and knew that Claw Island was the secret tunnel that the remnants of the Soul Order used to infiltrate. At the same time, they also knew that the island and the lake and the half-abandoned base on it were rented by this Mr. Mo. They even went up to investigate, but other than a bunch of exoskeleton parts and some strange compound materials, they didn't find anything new. Not finding anything is the prelude to a great discovery. Captain Jimmy could come up with over 100 reasons at any time if he wanted to make up a story. The current Blood Flame Order, or to be more precise, Madame Halder's Blood Flame Order, is like a stray dog. They ran from Xia City to T-City, and it's said that they aren't doing too well. Under these circumstances, the second-in-command of the order accompanied this so-called Mr. Mo to Saka City to purchase property and then conducted research and experiments midway. What a touching logic. Dor opened his mouth, but he suddenly discovered that he had nothing to say. Captain Jimmy used his terrible mood to make groundless and far-fetched claims. He forcefully wrung out a complete logical chain. Following his train of thought, even Menda felt that this Mr. Mo was very suspicious. Hold on, this has nothing to do with us. Really? Are you sure? After a series of debates, Captain Jimmy felt that he had returned to his peak. He even laughed. He extended his hand and drew a circle in the air. He pointed out, "Why do I feel that their attitude is very unfriendly?" While Captain Jimmy was talking loudly in the warehouse at the dock, Snake Tongue furrowed her brows several hundred meters away on the yacht. That fellow on the other side was pestering her endlessly, but his senses were quite sharp. Especially when that group of people had entered a state of combat readiness. They were connected to each other and formed a network. They naturally formed a highly integrated offensive and defensive fortress on the mental plane. The spell probing she was used to before now seemed a bit rash. Her surveillance made the other party react, but it wasn't that easy to get rid of it. As an outstanding cursemancer, she was an expert when it came to curses, stimulation, and control of living creatures. At this distance, as long as there were mosquitoes or crawling insects in the warehouse, they could form a monitoring network. They wouldn't be affected by ordinary mental attacks. At most, they could see the information directly or indirectly. But she still had to say, the growth rate of technology was truly fast. Snake Tongue had dealt with Deep Blue walkers quite a few times in the past. In fact, ever since the Deep Blue platform appeared, it had always been the focus of the inner world's research. Ability users had very complicated feelings towards this group of people that obtained extraordinary power through the transformation of the human body. Snake Tongue was no exception. But after wasting half a year in the cloud world and returning to reality, Snake Tongue discovered that she needed remedial lessons. More and more characters worthy of attention appeared on the Deep Blue platform. Let's not talk about superstars like Tian Bang, who was the #1 person below the extraordinary level. She felt that there were quite a few noteworthy points in this operation team she had randomly encountered. The problem right now was that Captain Jimmy had accidentally hit the nail on the head. He had a temperament of an unpredictable bomb. Luo Nan might not like this news. Yin Li's call came in just as she was thinking. There weren't any pleasantries. She just wanted to remind her that Luo Nan would soon return to the yacht and that she needed to pay attention to matters during this time. It looked like the situation was quite urgent. Halfway through the conversation, Luo Nan became the one speaking. "Your Excellency." Snake Tongue's attitude immediately changed subtly. She carefully memorized the instructions and repeated them before responding, "Hey, I understand." Snake Tongue immediately got up when the call ended and headed to the yacht's storage area. At Luo Nan's request, a raw material processing area had been temporarily partitioned off. It was mainly used to process the compound raw materials he used daily, extract nutrients, and the like. Originally, it wasn't that particular. But in the past 2 days, it seemed that he had obtained a series of pre-processing techniques from an expert that could effectively increase his usage efficiency. Snake Tongue was a cursemancer. She was quite accomplished in the field of pharmacology, so she took over this heavy responsibility. She provided Luo Nan with the rough processing materials he needed for his experiments every day. It was said that these materials were used to make something like a sarcolemma. As she passed by the outer deck, she saw the commercial vehicle that had returned to the dock at Yin Li's request turn around to pick up Luo Nan. The capricious orders were clearly controlled by Luo Nan's flickering inspiration. In fact, the yacht, which had already entered a half-resting state, became active once more under Luo Nan's will. The crew ran up and down, taking their respective positions. Snake Tongue had just finished preparing the materials she had accumulated over the past few days in the storage area when she heard the low hum of an electric motor. This was proof that Luo Nan had already arrived at the dock. Afterwards, the yacht would temporarily take him away from this densely populated area and into the depths of North Mountain Lake. Chapter 846. The commercial car went back and forth, Luo Nan boarded the boat, the yacht left the shore, and the boat drove into the center of the lake. There were no accidents in this series of processes. They were extremely compact, without any buffer gaps. Such a rhythm was rare for Luo Nan, at least from Snake Tongue's point of view. Ever since they got to know each other for a long time, the impression Luo Nan gave her in most situations was that he spent long periods of time pondering and delving. He was in an illusory and mysterious state of emptiness. Occasionally, they would interact, and he would be cold and hard, piercing into the deepest depths of one's heart. The current scene was more like someone whipping him from behind or rushing to the front to fight an intense battle. Snake Tongue originally wanted to report the latest intelligence on monitoring Captain Jimmy and the others, but she couldn't find an opportunity to interrupt. After Luo Nan boarded the yacht, he went directly to the warehouse area. He checked the raw materials provided by Snake Tongue and confirmed that they were sufficient. He didn't say anything, but a layer of smoke spread out from his body. The temporarily separated warehouse area wasn't that big. Whether it was Snake Tongue or Yin Lo, they were soon enveloped by the smoke. Their figures became hazy and indistinct. What was this? Yin Lo turned her head in shock, wanting to communicate with Snake Tongue. However, the two lacked tacit understanding in the end. Snake Tongue didn't pay attention to Yin Lo. She just silently watched the roiling smoke beside her, as well as the more detailed components within. Snake Tongue wasn't able to discern too many details because her psychic senses were greatly restricted within this smoke. And the more she delved into the details, the more fuzzy her probing mental senses became. It was as if countless fine blades were sliced into pieces and scattered randomly. They were turned upside down and confused. In the end, she simply doubted her usual self-logic. This feeling was terrible. More importantly, it stimulated Snake Tongue. It made her remember that she had vaguely experienced this scene before. Yes, the cloud world, the mist maze. This was the bizarre location where Luo Nan had attacked, oppressed, and bound Gong Chi. Snake Tongue often boasted that she was experienced and knowledgeable, but she had never seen such a bizarre and despairing world in her entire life. It was precisely there that snake tongue and death overlapped. Perhaps it was just a hair's breadth of difference. No matter when she thought about it, she couldn't get rid of the feeling of suffocation. It was also there that she completely lost her freedom of life. Perhaps this included the future that she could look forward to. Snake Tongue's gaze shifted and swept over Lee's blurry face. This woman was curiously looking around as if she didn't know anything. This allowed Snake Tongue to have an even clearer judgment regarding the mist maze. That place was undoubtedly Luo Nan's top secret. Perhaps it was the core source of all of his abilities. Think about it. A sandstorm maze formed from 1 trillion domain fragments. Any random fragment from the maze would be a rare treasure on the inner world plane. How much of it was mixed in the smoke that filled the air? That place was a terrifying prison, but at the same time, it was also an incredible treasure trove. Even with Luo Nan's strength, he absolutely could not let it see the light of day for a long time to come. Unfortunately, he was involved. Even if he wasn't killed, he would have to pay an extra price. Snake Tongue was lost in a rare moment of absent-mindedness due to the awakening of her terrible memories. When her attention returned, she discovered that a dark red exoskeleton frame had appeared within the mist, sticking close to Luo Nan's torso at some unknown time. Where did this come from? The dark red was a rather eye-catching color within the ash-white smoke. It seemed to be flowing endlessly, as if it was the blood contained within the entire frame. Within the flowing bloody light, the connective tissue and muscle tissue fragments of the same hue seemed to be woven by invisible needles and threads. They stuck close to the surface of the skeleton, gradually taking shape. Correspondingly, the rough processing materials Snake Tongue had prepared, as well as the nutrients specially used to replenish the human body's energy, were consumed at an astonishing rate. They were swallowed into the depths of the smoke. Luo Nan possessed the ability to rapidly produce human cells and tissues, or perhaps he possessed the tools to do so. Snake Tongue still remembered how shocked she was the first time she saw such a scene. But now she was completely accustomed to it, and she knew that Luo Nan's ability had its limits. In the end, the exoskeleton frame was unable to form a complete body. It merely formed a thin layer of muscular-like structure. It wrapped around and covered most of the skeleton, and it stretched and contracted endlessly. It caused the entire frame to tighten and deform, but it also fit the contours of Luo Nan's body. Snake Tongue had seen a similar scene more than once in the past few days. The speed at which it formed was much faster than this time. Yes, she felt that Luo Nan's speed at forming the muscular-like structure was much slower today. There were even some areas that were a bit hesitant. Snake Tongue had just thought of this when she saw the mostly formed muscular-like structure in the chest and abdomen region of the exoskeleton frame burn into ashes. Bionic tissue began to grow wildly at the edges of the gap, spreading and bonding to fill the gap. There was a change in the design train of thought. Snake Tongue was able to guess this, and Luo Nan spoke at this time. I remember that there are still some exoskeleton accessories here. There are, but they aren't as complete as the ones in the warehouse at Claw Island and the hydroelectric power station. Lu reacted quickly. She had long since given up on probing into the profound principles behind Luo Nan's actions. She just waited to deal with the corresponding mundane matters. It's in the other room. I'll go get it. Yeah. See if there are any RAC model wires. I'll have to deal with the sensitivity a bit. Okay. Lu turned around and left. Luo Nan didn't idle while waiting. He opened up the virtual work area, and an extremely complex configuration design was already drawn on it. Snake Tongue shifted her gaze and swept it over. She felt dizzy. However, Luo Nan took the initiative to point at her. In a bit, you'll have to help me install the wires. I need to make adjustments immediately. I can't free up my hands. Yeah. Snake Tongue didn't have any leeway to refuse. Can you understand the design diagram? I can't. Snake Tongue's response was extremely decisive. This was absolutely not the time to act. Otherwise, she would be the one to lose face in a bit. Luo Nan could understand. It doesn't matter. This is just a temporary reinforcement. It mainly depends on the finesse of the operation. Just do it step by step according to what I said. Yeah, I still need to explain the basic logic. He made a hand gesture, and the configuration diagram on the virtual work area was simplified by quite a bit in an instant. It revealed a rather distinct three-layer structure of inner, middle, and outer. Right now I'm using the lamination interference technology. According to my research with Dean Wan, this is a kind of disguise technique that uses perfection to imitate imperfection. First, I do addition, then I do subtraction. Right now I'm doing addition. The basic logic is like this: through the configuration design, I take the imperfect situation of the main body, and through the transition of the exoskeleton and other auxiliary frames, I gradually fill in and make up for it. I map it onto my strongest spacetime configuration, forming a relatively perfect mapping. The meaning of this perfect is quite complicated, but it's something like this. Understand? The first thing Snake Tongue thought of was the attributive word, strongest, before the spacetime configuration. Why did she feel that Luo Nan's strongest point should be mental piercing and control? Chapter 847. The victim's abdomen was meaningless. Snake Tongue cleared her distracting thoughts, and her line of sight pierced through the pervasive smoke. She saw that this blurry area still had certain restrictions. After eliminating the influence of obstacles, a relatively complete circle appeared on the whole. She vaguely understood Luo Nan's meaning. The exoskeleton is basically equivalent to a padding, but it's also an orderly operating system. It filled in the abilities that the body didn't have and increased the power that the body didn't have. The relationship between it and the main body was equivalent to the gear set that His Excellency had mentioned before, that coupling theory. The coupling between the inside and the outside will form an organic whole, amplifying one's own strength and stirring up even greater power in the world. That's right. You were the same back then. You understood it the moment you heard it. Luo Nan grinned his teeth in delight. He was a bit pleasantly surprised. The corner of Snake Tongue's mouth perked up, but the curve of her lips was mostly filled with bitterness. At this moment, the magnificent power raised by the gear set that was embedded in the void surged up from the depths of his memory. Moreover, as the timeline moved forward, it became more and more majestic and unstoppable. Back then, he had recklessly used his own small gear to pry open the big gear of the world. Today, just his existence alone was already a marvel of the world, unfathomable and unattainable. Such a change only took the time of a nightmare in the cloud world. Perhaps this change itself was a nightmare. At this moment, Enlu came in with the metal box containing the wires. Sir, she paused halfway through her words. Her gaze shifted between Luo Nan's and Snake Tongue's faces. She paused for about a second before she opened the case and displayed the relevant equipment. The RAC wire is here. Luo Nan nodded slightly. He wasn't in a hurry to get into action. Instead, he continued to communicate with Snake Tongue about the corresponding concepts. It is indeed a coupling, but there is one thing that is different from the last time. This time, I don't need to pry anything. Instead, I need to merge with the big gear set of heaven and earth so that it doesn't stand out. But at the same time, I need to make my own characteristics stand out. The work of integration will be completed in the addition stage. You must fully realize the coupling effect. This is the foundation. The work of highlighting will be completed in the subtraction stage. You must highlight the sense of design. Now, get ready. Yes. Snake Tongue adjusted her breathing and took out the wire from the metal case she had already opened. She gradually understood. Luo Nan's conversation with her was actually to further clarify his train of thought. Therefore, during this period, the configuration design of the virtual workspace was adjusted to a certain extent. It felt more concise and clear. In comparison, Snake Tongue's operation phase was lackluster. She just appeared as an AI assistant. She followed Luo Nan's instructions and installed the wires in the designated locations. Snake Tongue had installed a total of over 30 wires, and they were arranged inside and outside the exoskeleton frame. They were like a mixture of neurons, muscle fibers, blood vessels, and other functional tissues. Every time a wire was installed, the exoskeleton frame would react, and it was an obvious change in shape. The muscle membrane structure produced by the transformation would also quickly cover it, making it look like a single entity. Snake Tongue didn't have the time to look at it in detail. She listened attentively to Luo Nan's instructions. She was engrossed in the installation and traction work. When the work was complete, she tried to look at the fruits of her labor as a whole. But she was stunned to discover that the scenery before her eyes was fading away. The smoke that practically covered the entire warehouse area was fading away without end. This wasn't a result of the leakage and decrease in concentration due to the tight seal. Instead, it corresponded to the steps of continuous adjustment. The chaotic dust within the smoke was like a jigsaw puzzle that gradually became orderly. The orderly layers gradually became clear, forming a stable and ethereal structure. It blended together with the surrounding void that she was accustomed to. The exoskeleton frame also blended inside. Within the fading smoke, the dark infrared exoskeleton, which had just pulled the wires and wrapped the muscle membrane, seemed to have been rubbed by an eraser. Its structure, color, and even substance all became faint and fuzzy. Then it disappeared one by one until it was completely hidden. In the end, only Luo Nan's figure remained in the middle of the warehouse area. He stood there quietly with his head slightly lowered. It seemed that he was pondering something. The smoke, the exoskeleton, and all the corresponding scenes were like an illusion. However, one only needed to see that the vast majority of the compound raw material reserves had been consumed and the empty metal case in Yin Li's hands. Luo Nan knew that everything that had just happened was true without a doubt. Snake Tongue thought of Luo Nan's words from a few minutes ago, the large gear set that wanted to merge with heaven and earth. The merging was quite thorough. As for how Luo Nan was able to accomplish this, Snake Tongue really couldn't guess. The operation of this round far exceeded the scope of her knowledge structure. Snake Tongue was stunned, and Yin Li's reaction was even greater. She blurted out a question. "Is it done?" "A portion. I still need to test it." Luo Nan flexed and extended his 10 fingers as he spoke. After confirming that his movements were unhindered, he reached out to touch his face. With a slight movement, a smoke-like layer of fine muslin was peeled off. His facial features underwent a subtle change. Snake Tongue and Yin Li suddenly came to a realization. Luo Nan had been using the identity of Mr. Mo for the past few days. His facial features had been modified by the muslin of invisibility. However, after interacting with him for a long time, his unique characteristics had unwittingly caused them to overlook the difference in appearance. From this angle, the disguise was quite a failure. Luo Nan didn't care about the thoughts of others. He used his fingertips to twirl the muslin in his hand, experiencing the marvelous state that existed between the virtual and the real. Then, he tossed it up. Snake Tongue and Yin Li's attention naturally gathered over. The muslin of invisibility was practically weightless due to its special material properties. It easily broke free of gravity. It was like smoke or mist, stretching, shifting, and bobbing up and down in the air. Soon, a dozen seconds passed, but nothing happened. Another dozen seconds passed. Luo Nan's face was expressionless as he extended his hand and took off the muslin of invisibility. Yin Li, who had been a chatterbox before, instantly felt extremely embarrassed. Luo Nan didn't say a word. He continued to twirl the muslin with his fingertips, searching for the feeling. The muslin of invisibility was a product of lamination interference technology, but it wasn't the core item. Instead, it was a kind of extension product. It wasn't a natural material. Instead, it underwent the effects of the so-called lamination interference spirit core. It underwent a transformation of quality and energy over the years, absorbing special particles from the outside world to weave itself into a strange object. The lamination interference spirit core was like a shuttle. As long as it existed, it would simultaneously accumulate and weave on both the material and mental planes, endlessly expanding the scale of the muslin of invisibility. It would also memorize a few commonly used patterns, making it easier to realize concealment and camouflage. From this point of view, once the experiment of the lamination interference technology was successful, the experimental product would certainly be able to form a special effect with the muslin of invisibility, and vice versa. Let alone a special effect, not even the most basic of interference effects could be seen. It was at this time that Snake Tongue bowed to show her respect. She acted as if she was completely convinced. Your Excellency's divine skill. Chapter 848. Luo Nan didn't show any joy towards Snake Tongue's praise. He continued to twirl the muslin and responded calmly, "It can be considered a success, but the design of the spirit core is still a bit lacking." What are they talking about? Yin Luo was confused. In terms of cultivation, she and Luo Nan really didn't have much of a tacit understanding. She was able to accept this fact, but right now, she was completely excluded from Luo Nan and Snake Tongue's small circle. She felt far too uncomfortable. Taking a deep breath, Yin Luo adjusted her state of mind and used the most honest method to participate. "Sir, what did you just do? Examine the interference effect between the constructed gear set and the outside world." Luo Nan chose Snake Tongue's description, and the source came from himself. Seeing Yin Li's blank expression, he explained a little more. "I hope to achieve 2 effects. Oh, it should be 3 effects. The first is that the newly constructed gear set can be seamlessly embedded into the big gear set of heaven and earth. This is basically achieved." Luo Nan reached out his hand and fiddled with it a few times. He didn't feel any obstruction at all. He gestured to Yin Luo to give it a try. Yin Luo reached out her hand in a daze, and without any obstruction, she touched Luo Nan's chest. She subconsciously apologized and retracted her arm. However, she bumped into something along the way and her arm was locked down by a solid object, rendering her unable to move. It was also at this moment that Yin Luo realized that there was a slight refraction in the surrounding air with a vague silhouette appearing around her arm. Exoskeleton? This is invisibility. No, it's a void layer. Yin Luo immediately thought of the crystal ball in her bag and the devil ray swimming in it. More or less. The demonstrative clamp was released, and the exoskeleton frame was embedded back into the sandwich domain. Luo Nan nodded slightly. "This is my strong suit, and it's the best state I can reach right now." Unfortunately, the second effect wasn't realized, the connection with the invisible yarn. This means that there are still flaws in the design of the spirit core. Yin Luo didn't really understand this part, but she finally had a vague idea. She didn't delve into the details and continued to ask, "Then the third effect is, the game character logs into the internet." "Oh, it's long-distance mapping. We still have to try it out." Yin Li's cognitive network almost broke again. She was stunned for 2 seconds before continuing, "Long distance? How far is it?" Before Luo Nan could reply, the latest news came from the intelligence channel. Yin Luo originally didn't want to pay attention to it, but the priority of the information was higher, and it involved the kind of people that needed special attention. The relevant information was directly projected onto the retina. A local bright light phenomenon appeared over the Pacific Ocean. There were signs of extraordinary activity. The intercontinental airships passing through this area were rumored to have been hijacked. The area of the incident was 1,500 kilometers away from Osaka City, and it was highly suspected that the Amaterasu order was deeply involved. And at this time, Luo Nan clearly responded, "It should be at least 1,400–500 kilometers." Yin Li's body trembled. At the same time, she could feel Snake Tongue suddenly raise her head from the side. Her gaze focused on Luo Nan's face. Luo Nan saw that Yin Luo didn't have any new questions, so he turned his attention back to the work in front of him. He frowned slightly. "I've delayed things a bit. It's impossible to be perfect, Mr. My lord." Yin Luo and Snake Tongue spoke at the same time. They instantly exchanged glances, but this time neither of them had any intention of declining modestly. That airship, the Deep Blue operation team at the warehouse, has been affected by the airship incident, and their operations have come to a halt. However, that Captain Jimmy has a few unfavorable associations with us. The importance of the information on both sides, including the depth involved, was different from the very beginning. Luo unconsciously stopped talking and gave way to Snake Tongue. Luo Nan's gaze also pointed over there. Oh. Speaking of which, be it Snake Tongue or Luo, they weren't too sure about Luo Nan's degree of involvement in the airship incident. But right now, just by looking at his reaction to the word airship, there was no longer any doubt. Snake Tongue's expression could still be considered calm, but the speed of her heartbeat had unwittingly increased by a level compared to a few seconds ago. Right now, she finally understood the severity of the situation behind Luo Nan's series of actions. Therefore, she used the most concise and accurate words to summarize Captain Jimmy's nonsense once. Then she expressed her own opinion. With Captain Jimmy's restless mood, it's very likely that he will make a rash move. If Master's current focus of attention is placed far away, we need to prepare a response plan as much as possible in advance. We can't let it become a negative interference. Snake Tongue had already spoken quite bluntly. At the very least, Luo understood tacitly. If Luo Nan really wanted to compete with the major powers of the Amaterasu Order 1,500 kilometers away, then let's not talk about how he was going to accomplish this. As the rear, absolutely no problems could happen to Ban City. Even in normal times, this would be a very troublesome matter, let alone now. Snake Tongue and Luo both looked at Luo Nan's reaction. Indeed, Luo Nan furrowed his brows. Don't tell me we have to have two characters. This is a bit difficult. Let's deal with the airship first. Could they deal with the other side as well? Even Snake Tongue's level of understanding wasn't enough. On the other hand, Luo finally had the leeway to use her brain when it came to mundane matters. She quickly said, I'll immediately contact the city's side and the boss's side. I'll tell them about Mr. Mo's identity. It'll be good if we can interfere with them a bit. As for Mr. Mo. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. Can we first leave the yacht? Temporarily avoid contact with them, just like 10 days ago. Luo made the connection to Luo Nan's mysterious and possibly world-shaking operation last time. It also began with leaving the yacht. We really do need to leave. What Luo said was already within Luo Nan's plans. Since she mentioned it, he didn't say anything more. He simply waved his hand. You guys keep an eye on this side. I'll go greet True God and the Pope. If things go smoothly, it shouldn't take too long. Yes. Huh. Luo suddenly froze on the spot, and Snake Tongue wasn't any better. Luo Nan was truly straightforward and efficient. He simply turned around and headed outside after speaking. The warehouse's exit wasn't in front of him, but the sealed cabin wall of the yacht. The scene of the yacht's cabin wall being torn apart 10 days ago instantly flashed in Lee's mind. She subconsciously opened her mouth, but before she could speak, she saw Luo Nan's figure pass through the rack of materials in front of the cabin wall like a phantom. He also passed through the thick cabin wall itself. There were no changes to the scene before him. The only thing missing was the living person. Chapter 849. Luo Nan walked at the bottom of Beishan Lake. To put it more accurately, he rode a self-made bubble to shuttle through the structure of space and time at the bottom of Beishan Lake. What he felt at this time and place was not the pressure of millions and millions of tons of water. Instead, it was the vast and boundless acceptance and rejection of the local structure of space and time that was hard to describe. Luo Nan slightly altered the old-fashioned analogy that Snake Tongue used. He was a temporary creation, a mutated gear set. He wanted to change his original role. He wanted to obtain more authority and occupy a more important position in the great machine and the great production line created by all living things in the world. He undoubtedly had to compete with other gear sets with similar structures, but they were even tighter and sturdier. This was an enormous challenge, and it was extremely intuitive. As Luo Nan walked between the structure of space and time, the pressure was everywhere. It penetrated the outer layer of the space-time bubble and acted upon the embryonic exoskeleton frame. During this time, a portion of the pressure was dispelled by his sandwich domain. Even so, he was still able to clearly hear the vibrating hum of the mutant skeletal material, which had gone through many layers of processing and forging. Occasionally, the sound would be hoarse or sharp. This was a sign of damage to the material structure. This pressure far exceeded the intensity of the water pressure at the bottom of the lake. But the bubble he designed was able to withstand the initial test. It traveled in a straight line through the complex environment at the bottom of Beishan Lake. Whether it was the undercurrent surging in the water layer or the crooked and scattered ruins of the city, they were unable to create any substantial obstruction. There were also the sensitive creatures at the bottom of the lake, including the mutants. They had completely overlooked such a blank target. This was because Luo Nan was walking in another dimension. In a certain sense, he was a part of this world. He was a redundancy that was hard to discover within the established structure of space and time. This was a relatively conservative standby state. Only in this way could the exoskeleton frame, which was not that perfect in its workmanship, be able to endure for a period of time. Luo Nan earnestly sensed the feeling of being in the great gear set and the great production line of the world. Right now, he did not possess the mysterious feeling of becoming one with heaven and earth. He only had a simple feeling of tightness, smoothness, and difficulty when the gears meshed with each other. He used these as a basic comparison to make the corresponding corrections. Gradually, this feeling became more abundant, becoming more exquisite and complicated. Sometimes, his reaction couldn't keep up, and it was hard for him to make adjustments in time. Fortunately, this feedback was clear and continuous. It helped Luo Nan adjust his position. From the theoretical ideal state of the laboratory, he adapted step by step to the variables of the real world. Also, they had to test the remote login that had to be realized immediately. I need to adjust my character properly when I log in. I almost forgot. Luo Nan loosened his hand and took out the crystal ball from Yin Li's backpack. He silently merged it into the space-time bubble. It was as if the devil ray inside had been sucked up from a deep well. It approached from afar, its body rapidly enlarging and recovering. Its wing-like pectoral fins undulated up and down as it swam around Luo Nan. From Luo Nan's angle, the two sides were so close that the tip of the devil ray's fin and stinger streaked past his eyelids time and time again. Even though this was a giant mutant, Luo Nan still placed it within a space-time bubble, isolating it from the normal space-time environment. The technique seemed simple, but it was actually peerlessly complex. Luo Nan was able to seamlessly connect such an enormous life form. It was completely built upon Luo Nan's long-term research on the Devil Ray and his even deeper attainments in space-time configuration. But this way, the space-time bubble was able to bear an even greater pressure. Hidden injuries had already appeared on part of the exoskeleton frame, and its durability was worrying. But today's matter could not be carried out in a protracted battle. Currently, it was too protracted. From the workshop to the yacht, and then to the bottom of the lake, it took at least 20 minutes to make a full circle. During this time, Luo Nan and the true god practically broke away from each other. Luo Nan borrowed the advantage of pure observation of his soul strength to come and go as he pleased in the abyss region. Luo Nan was barely able to hook onto the true god, making it hard for the true god to come to a conclusion. Otherwise, the true god would have long since turned his attention to Luo Nan and swept through all of Ban City. Even so, the true god was certainly suspicious. Over at Ban City, the search activities originating from the Amaterasu Pure Land on the mental plane continued to intensify and become more and more strict. Human flesh search and offline PK. This was the fundamental train of thought of the true god and the Pope. This matter could happen anywhere, but it could not happen in Ban City. Luo Nan narrowed his eyes slightly. His gaze pierced through the barrier of the void and the rippling waves of water. In a trance, he saw a similar environment 1,500 kilometers away. It was also below the surface of the water, but it was nearly 100 meters deep at the bottom of the sea. Luo Nan chose this sort of environment to be the novice village for his new character to log online. To put it bluntly, it was the place where the space-time bubble would begin its remote mapping. With the support of the Soul Cloak, which covered the entire world and had the condensation ring as its foundation, there was no environment more suitable for exerting power than an environment rich in water molecules. What Luo Nan needed to do was to borrow the Soul Cloak to project the basic configuration design of his main body over. Of course, his consciousness came along with it. Luo Nan's consciousness really seemed to have grown from the bottom of the sea 1,500 kilometers away. He was very familiar with this. He often used similar methods over the past few months to project the core of his own concept into the South Pacific Ocean. He borrowed the abundant water vapor conditions there to play hide-and-seek with the powerful extraordinaries from all over the world. He misled them, embedding the concepts of Enlightenment Palace and a new plane within. Luo Nan even gave this method a name. It was called Luo's Core. From his perspective, Luo's core and lamination interference technology should be equivalent in terms of core. They were both rooted in the configuration system. But the former spent most of their time hiding behind natural phenomena, confusing the public and seeing, forever hiding in the shadows of people's perception. But Luo Nan relied on the lamination interference technology to become the focal point of everything. He controlled the information that was leaked to the outside, turning the fake into the real. He withstood the multidimensional test of extraordinaries. This required the pinnacle of detail. In extreme situations, the nitpicking of details was never a test of one's attitude. It was a test of technique. The conditions of seawater and lake water were different. There was an essential difference between what was real and what was fake. What was fake was fake. Some laboratory designs would naturally reveal their flaws after the environment changed. The cause might just be the change in air pressure, temperature difference, or even salinity. Luo Nan would never have thought of these details when he was constructing his theory. Even now, he couldn't consider putting all the conditions in. Otherwise, the configuration design would be cumbersome. His head might explode before he could even face a true god. Luo Nan could only rely on the principles of the lamination interference technology and his own attainments in spacetime configuration to add and subtract. He let the negative feedback of the outside world grind away the mistakes and redundant things. He was currently the redundancy between heaven and earth. But in order to achieve this high-level redundancy, he needed to abandon the low-level design. He needed to grasp the elements that were more in line with the essence. He needed an existence that was infinitely close to reality to be placed there. He needed to obtain the natural feedback of heaven and earth. This was a process of constant grinding and adjustment. It was to the point where Luo Nan ignored the passage of time in the outside world. He ignored the concrete changes until the sunlight pierced through the seawater and illuminated the gloomy world. Ah, I've been discovered. Was it that kind of discovery? Chapter 850. The interference power that came from within the light carried a familiar flavor. This was the unique quality of a true god. It wasn't an absolute thing to say. Even though they were of the same system, the feeling the Pope gave off was more or less the same. In any case, it was the kind of bright, dazzling, fully burning, scorching feeling. This power combined with the rules and laws of the great divine treasure of the propping mulberry tree. It was like a propulsion furnace that supplied energy to the propping mulberry tree. It was also like the entire propping mulberry tree was its fuel. However, there was still a slight difference from the brief confrontation that occurred a few days ago in the wilderness laboratory. Back then, the true God, under the urging of negative emotions, did not hold back at all. The true God tore through the barrier of the void and smashed over. But now, the true God was in a semi-detached state, performing a routine scan. He had accidentally caught the true God pausing for an instant before the true God exerted its power a second time. This tiny disconnect was far too obvious and slow on Luo Nan's current level. He even had the time to adjust a set of configuration details in response to the sudden change in environment. Only then did he stir, allowing the projected spacetime bubble, no, it should be said that the game character he had just created, to log in and go online. No matter how tedious, tense, and precise the preparatory work he had done before logging in, no matter how much energy he had consumed, Luo Nan's mood was strangely calm when he truly arrived at the moment of verification. Against the light that illuminated the surrounding seabed, Luo Nan came into contact with the true god's pressure that penetrated through space. He had a rough idea of what was going on. A slight distortion occurred in the structure of the seawater 100 meters deep. A high-frequency vibration existed on the mental plane, destroying the existing environment. It also forced the surrounding living beings to break away from their original rhythm and expose themselves. The true god's methods could not be said to be wrong. In fact, they were quite brilliant. The underwater life forms in the surrounding area were like a sieve. They were screened out as long as they had the slightest bit of suspicion. Immediately after, a scorching mental attack, like an electric net, came down with a buzz. In 3 to 5 seconds, the lives of over a dozen species, whether they were mutants or ordinary sea creatures, were forcefully stripped away. But at this time, the new character, who had just logged in, followed the tiny arc of the distorted spacetime structure. It smoothly shuttled back and forth. It was as if the character was sliding on a guideway. Even though there was still a slight dissonance when the gears were engaged and switched, it added a proper texture. On this trajectory, the mental attacks that could have been fatal were like brilliant fireworks. They seemed to explode at a low altitude, like stars falling like rain, but in reality, they did not hit the ground at all. An error in judgment. Of course, this was a mistake on the part of the true god. His attack had completely missed. From Luo Nan's perspective, this was an excellent piece of evidence. The configuration design idea has passed the test. The conduction and transformation of the soul cloak are also going smoothly. It's basically operating without any problems, but the feedback from the outside world needs to be corrected. What about the degree of realism? The controller at the bottom of North Mountain Lake was still thinking in an orderly manner. But at the same time, the experiencer, who shared the same lineage at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, received a clear, powerful, and admiring mental message from a true god. You're here. Good job. It was indeed excellent. Luo Nan gave himself a thumbs up without the slightest hesitation. Looking at it from a certain angle, the true god was exposing his own ignorance, and Luo Nan absolutely wouldn't be so kind as to warn him. Luo Nan didn't receive a response, but the true god's transmitted mental message clearly contained impatience. There wasn't the slightest bit of hesitation within it. The soul cloak that completely covered Luo Nan transmitted back feedback. Within the clouds of the stratosphere, the true god's transmitted power made another round of movement. The center of gravity changed, and it locked onto the surface of the distant Pacific Ocean. Soon, an even more direct response appeared from the depths of the sea. The roots of the Fusang divine tree were rapidly digging in, interweaving into an incorporeal network. The blazing power churned, interfering with each other on the mental and material planes, forming burst after burst of intense light. It was like a photographer's capture operation. The range was correct, but the situation of losing focus was more serious. At least, Luo Nan hadn't truly been locked onto yet. Luo Nan had even abandoned many things during this period of time. Perhaps the addition of these things would have been more perfect in theory, but in actual combat, in a rapidly changing environment, these were merely meaningless details. The true god wouldn't pay attention to them, and Luo Nan didn't need to waste them. The situation was developing in the direction that Luo Nan hoped for. It was absolutely impossible to create a Luo Nan riding a devil ray and directly greet a true god. But he had to make those two believe, at least partially, that Luo Nan was right here without truly seeing Luo Nan face to face. So far, Luo Nan had succeeded. Luo Nan maintained his silence. He controlled the space-time bubble to shuttle back and forth within the tight structure of space and time. Whether it was the bottom of Beishan Lake or the Pacific Ocean, it was the same. One was the main body. The other was a projection. But the difference between the two? No, it should be said that there was a common characteristic. It was constantly being modified by the space-time bubble, and it was gradually internalized. It became a kind of instinct, a kind of nearly natural attribute. Before the structure of the space-time bubble collapsed, it was probably like this. In this way, the consciousness of the experiencer grew stronger and stronger. The consciousness of the controller gradually retreated to a secondary position, retreating to a more fundamental level. It was like an iceberg of the subconscious, and it formed an internalized driving force. Luo Nan didn't think too much about complicated problems for the time being. He was like a damn otaku immersed in a game. He went to experience a novel feeling that originated from him, but he had never experienced it before. The bottom of the sea is fine. I'm now above the surface of the sea. Luo Nan took the initiative to change the environment. The space-time bubble changed its trajectory, and it naturally adjusted its operation method. It only took half a second to pass from the high-pressure region at the bottom of the sea to the spacious and graceful night sky. Perhaps there was 1,000th of a second where the sudden change in external conditions caused the gears to bite together. There was some disharmony, but soon, everything returned to a harmonious and natural state. The senses of a true god could be said to be sharp. Luo Nan's reaction was also extremely fast. He was able to capture these minute fluctuations. He could no longer tell whether it was a powerful light or a torrent of energy. It cleaved across the surface of the sea. But he was still a hair too slow. The entire process was just a hair too slow. Whoosh! Luo Nan could feel the impact that practically wiped out all of his efforts. But it still didn't hit, right? At this moment, he no longer tried to distinguish the difference between his main body and his projection. He really did enter a state of immersion. He really was playing a game. He was going to experience a relatively perfect Luo Nan, a brand new self that logged online in the same world. The simple and pure Luo core was enough to support this experience. It allowed him to drive the omnipresent soul cloak, to form a closer connection with this world of the sea and sky that was abundant with water vapor. Chapter 851. The region of the soul cloak was fragmented, rising and falling amidst the fine waves of the sea breeze. Luo Nan was within the cogwheel set of the space-time structure. He moved and did not move. What did not move was his role. In the strict structure of time and space, the change opened up an undeserved gap, becoming a redundancy that was originally non-existent. It continued to operate without being directly rejected. What moved was his relative position. From the bottom of the sea to the sky, from the deep water to the clouds, he drove millions upon millions of water molecules to gather and disperse, provoking the senses of a true god. He was like the water spirit of legend. He leaped and shuttled through the water vapor, coming and going unfathomably. This feeling was a bit similar to an out-of-body experience. Ever since Luo Nan's soul cloak covered the entire world, he experienced less and less of this drifting feeling of a kite with its string cut. Luo Nan did not forget for a moment that his soul strength and fleshly body were still in a serious state of imbalance. Though he had the soul cloak's vast coverage to help disperse the imbalance, and he had the complex structure of the sandwich domain to provide a buffer, an imbalance was an imbalance. He had to pay attention to the coupling state of his body and soul frame at all times. He had to maintain a difficult balance between his god gear, which had entered an uncontrollable state of explosive expansion, and his body gear, which was limited by its physical nature. Sometimes, thoughts like this would jump out in Luo Nan's mind: I might as well throw away my fleshly body. It's so weak, clumsy, and it always drags me down. Especially when fighting against a powerful enemy. I have to split half of my mental energy to ponder over how to hide this fatal weakness. Of course, the leaping and flickering thoughts of humans were the most unreliable. From a rational point of view, abandoning one's fleshly body was the same as destroying one's foundation in the material world. The mode of existence of life, established over billions of years of evolutionary history, would transform into a phantom of nothingness. Perhaps there would be a certain amount of inertia in a short period of time, making it easier to operate. But in the long run, it was impossible to support the endless cultivation of the future. Whether it was the lessons of blood that had emerged endlessly in the short few decades of Earth, or the rigorous theories of the mysterious civilization displayed by the virtual brain system, all of them emphasized and verified this point from multiple perspectives. Luo Nan was a rational person under most circumstances. It was impossible for the occasional crazy thought to shake the wall of his rationality. He could not let his heart be blinded by lard and step onto a dead end. He was just taking a break from his busy schedule to experience the illusory pleasure of being completely unrestrained. Luo Nan was not completely illusory. In this state, Luo Nan already possessed the foundation of self-sufficient physical laws to a certain degree through the combination and interference of spacetime configurations. In fact, half a year ago, Luo Nan had used the condensation ring to break through the barrier between the mental and material planes in one fell swoop. He had realized the leap from 0 to 1. He had flown at a speed that exceeded everyone's imagination on this great road to the heavens. From the copulation between the condensation ring and the external neuron to the birth of the soul cloak. From the coupling of the divine chakra and the body chakra to the deep sea scene that was the foundation of the framework. Then, in the form of a soul cloak, it completely broke free from its shackles and extended to cover the earth and many other dimensions of space and time. When Luo Nan's attainments on the mental plane repeatedly broke through the limits of the imagination of ordinary people, the configuration system of the virtual brain system gave Luo Nan a timely path to deepen and feed back. His rapid progress in configuration design, especially in the design of spacetime configurations, allowed him to draw support from the omnipresent water molecules of every plane of space and time. He could even draw support from the even more inconceivable structure of space and time itself to construct a material foundation. He could twist the physical laws and temporarily replace a portion of his fleshly body. This gave him a feeling of immersion that was close to reality. Needless to say, there was even the true God, a scene setter. Right now, the true God was no longer making meaningless attempts after repeated fruitless attempts to converse with Luo Nan. Correspondingly, his methods became even more intense. The pitch-black curtain of night between the sea and the sky had already been sliced to pieces by the true God's blazing killing intent. In an area with a diameter of nearly 100 kilometers, a long and narrow band of intense light and lightning was left in the atmosphere. It left marks on the retinas of living beings that were hard to fade away in a short amount of time. The layers were complex and crisscrossed like an inescapable net. Any living being within this area, whether they were swimming in the sea, flying in the air, or floating on the surface of the water, was faced with imminent disaster. Even if they were not directly cut, just the aftershocks of the overlapping vibrations would press down from the mental plane to the material plane. Then the aftershocks would reverse the effects. After a few rounds of interference, a high-temperature furnace of boiling poisonous gas was formed. The violent killing intent of an extraordinary was far deadlier than any poison in the world. The true God was absolutely not the kind of idiot who wouldn't turn back until he ran into a wall. Don't look at how he had chased Luo Nan for a long time without success. He had other methods of dealing with this process. The projection of the Fusang divine tree shot through the air within this land of death. Its incorporeal roots extended outwards, greedily devouring the flesh, blood, and life force of the surrounding living beings. It borrowed the nourishment of the boiling emotions between life and death to gradually turn from a projection of nothingness into reality. At the very least, the power descending from the abyssal region grew more and more real and terrifying. At the same time, it formed an even more powerful compression effect on the surrounding void. The true God seemed to have sensed something. Having lost a reliable fulcrum of believers, it was very difficult for the true God to display a direct method like he did a few days ago in the wilderness. But the method of boiling a frog in warm water possessed a certain degree of feasibility. It manifested the true God's clear train of thought that was the complete opposite of his violent actions. The undulating undulations of his soul cloak were weakening in regularity. This was the result of the water molecules pervading the atmosphere suffering substantial damage. This was also the result of the warping and deformation of the structure of space and time. It was as if Luo Nan was playing a game of parkour. He had to find a relatively safe route in this vile environment. He had to avoid the projected space-time bubble from colliding head-on with the true God's Fusang divine tree system. Fortunately, this game had a time limit and a finish line. The true God's methods had already partially exceeded the scope of the Fusang divine tree system. It was the type of overclocking. Don't look at the oppressive warm water on the plane of reality. Compared to the abyssal region, it was already a volcanic eruption-like impact and turbulence. This was a good thing. Even with the true God's abilities, it was impossible to maintain this impact force for a long period of time over 1,000 kilometers. Therefore, Luo Nan knew what he had to do. His consciousness anchored the destination within the intermittent soul cloak and the warping void gap. It was the intercontinental airship that was gradually slowing down. It was already beginning to deviate from its course. It was also the location of the trap set up by the true God and the Pope. Luo Nan could more or less guess the situation over there. But no matter what, it was better for everyone to meet face to face. Chapter 852. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain of this flight. After careful evaluation, I am sorry to inform you that this flight will be turning around and returning. Yukawa Aisuk was sitting sideways on his seat, with most of his legs stuck in the aisle. His body was slack and he was still trying to digest the changes that had happened before and after he fainted. He was not in a good state. The after effects of forcefully attaching his soul had yet to subside. His skull was buzzing, and occasionally there was a sharp tinnitus. Under such circumstances, he automatically filtered out most of the broadcast information of the flight, leaving only the most important word, return. His eyeballs moved, and he glanced sideways from the corner of his eye. The key factor that caused all this was right in front of him. Less than 3 meters away, the puppet controlled by the Pope, like Yukawa Aisuk, was sitting sideways on his seat, facing the aisle, with his elbows on his knees and his body slightly leaning forward. This posture had not changed for a long time. But compared to the moment when Yukawa Aisuk opened his eyes, this puppet that looked like a business elite seemed to have been sucked dry of blood and water. All that was left was a skinny silhouette, like a mummy. There was almost no breath coming in and out of its mouth and nose. With such damage to its body, it was already a miracle that it could maintain the most basic vitality. It would be difficult to do anything more than that. But to the Pope, this was not a problem at all. The Pope's consciousness was still here, calmly calculating and living within his means to maintain the puppet's breath. At the same time, everyone in the first-class cabin still had to rely on him to survive. It was precisely because this breath was too weak that everyone in the spacious cabin held their breaths. In most cases, they were like wooden statues. Yukawa Aisuk was the same. No one restrained him, but in this kind of atmosphere, the only things he could use were his eyes and thoughts. In the beginning, he only looked at his surroundings dizzily, passively accepting the drastic changes that happened after the nightmare. As time passed, his mushy brain began to slowly recover, although this kind of recovery first brought about a sense of pain. Yukawa Aisuk saw the virtual workspace in front of the Pope's puppet, saw the mimicry of the spiritual sea, and saw the continuous appearance of chaotic ripples. Of course, he had heard and seen how the Pope taught by Xinyan how to operate the corresponding equipment. He almost didn't dare to think too deeply about the logic behind it. His mouth was full of bitterness. If possible, he hoped to delete all the orders and bargaining records related to the mimicry generator a few days ago, both in reality and in people's memories. However, this was only wishful thinking. Perhaps the relevant information was already placed on the Pope's desk, just waiting for an opportunity to act up. When I go back to Band City, I must. Can I not go back? Speaking of which, it was absolutely impossible for Yukawa Aisuk to leave the Pope puppet's side. As long as he recalled the scene where his mind felt as if he was trapped in a prison, his body involuntarily being controlled by others, fear and despair would follow him like a shadow, and there was no way to get rid of it. With the Pope by his side, Luo Nan wouldn't come again, right? Yukawa Aisuk adjusted his line of sight and looked at the porthole on the other side of the aisle. the first thing he saw was Kitano Suzuto's stout back. His head bodyguard's mind was no longer on his job. Instead, he was focused on observing the scene outside the porthole. Yukawa Isuke could understand this. This was because at this moment, there was a strong light burning marks on the airship's porthole from time to time. At first, the marks were blurry and intermittent, but they became clearer and denser. That was, the true god has captured Luo Nan's position. I hope it's true this time. Bai Xinyan, who was in the back seat, spoke as she adjusted the parameters of the equipment. Her tone was very pragmatic, but because she was too pragmatic, she didn't seem to pay much attention to details. As she spoke, the deformed sound of the atmosphere penetrated the airship's armor and transmitted inside. It rumbled in everyone's ears. This was the power of a true god. Who knew if it was his emotions? Bai Xinyan smiled faintly. But there is one thing that can be confirmed. Luo Nan didn't successfully escape. His judgment was correct. The mummified Pope puppet didn't respond. Clearly, the Pope didn't want to waste his limited resources on idle chatter. On the other hand, Yukawa Isuke's thoughts were still wandering. He subconsciously looked at his wristwatch. 22:42. It had been almost 20 minutes since he woke up. It was about the same amount of time since the most recent capture by a true god. During this period of time, almost everyone felt that Luo Nan had escaped. But now, the Pope was waiting silently. This perfectly displayed the difference in judgment between extraordinaries and normal people. But looking at it from another angle, Luo Nan, the bandit who could deprive others of their mental autonomy at any time, had endured under the eyes of a true god and the Pope for over 20 minutes. He had nearly exhausted the last drop of the Pope puppet's blood essence. He had almost succeeded. Unfortunately, he had failed on the verge of success. This was how Yukawa Isuke understood it. Why would he think of taking the initiative to provoke such a person? Every time he thought of this, Yukawa Isuke felt as if a handful of iron sand had been shoved into his chest, rubbing against it repeatedly. In any case, he should have let the true god and the Pope succeed this time. They should have killed that bastard. But in case they didn't, Yukawa Isuke subconsciously shivered. It was at this time that the cool bottle rested on the back of his hand. He almost subconsciously pushed it away, only to discover that something was wrong halfway through. It was a bottle of water from Bai Xinyan. Thank you. Yukawa Isuke subconsciously took it. He still remembered the warning and reminder Bai Xinyan gave him in that nightmare before he completely lost control of his body. This was a favor. But correspondingly, there were still some doubts in his heart that had yet to be cleared up. Just from today's incident alone, did he really provoke that uninvited bandit? He did offend Luo Nan quite badly. Taking the airship far away from Ban City really gave Luo Nan the opportunity to make a move. But there was a faintly discernible sense of dislocation. What was going on? Yukawa Isuke shook his wrist, causing the bottle of mineral water to shake as well. It made a hua-hua sound. Perhaps he should do more research. For example, he should give Ban City a call. Most of the time, he was driven by his instincts. He did whatever he thought of. For a moment, he forgot about the situation in front of him. He found the communication number of his subordinate, Takamoto Shigeru, and was about to make a call. What can you see like this? You might as well drink it quickly. Bai Xinyan's voice interrupted at this time, disrupting Yukawa Isuke's plan. Huh? Yukawa Isuke was a bit stupefied. Why did her words not connect? Did she miss something in the middle? That was indeed the case. At this time, Kitano Sukito, who had been observing the scene outside the porthole, had already turned around. He saw his boss's expression and coughed lightly. Miss Bai is talking about the problem of Luo Nan's extraordinary power acting as a medium. Luo Nan is an expert in manipulating water. Kitano Sukito was giving a reminder. His technique was a bit crude, but it was also the result of the current tense situation. It was hard for people to care about meaningless etiquette and face. They were straightforward, with few decorations. Yukawa Isuk didn't quite understand, but he didn't bother to hide it. So, he is one of the few people in the world with the most profound attainments in the condensation ring. Perhaps he is second only to Her Majesty Empress Wu. The condensation ring is currently the most efficient configuration technology known to probe into the water molecule level. Bai Xinyan pointed at the mimicry image of the mental sea. She also pointed at the corner of the image. She made some notes based on the changes in the image. Right now, we can basically confirm that every time heat appears, the water molecules in the atmosphere are abnormally active. The bubbles in the bottle of water were quite obvious just now. I was wondering if this was due to some sort of resonance effect. The corner of Yukawa Isuk's eye twitched a few times. The bottle of water in his hand suddenly turned into a red-hot soldering iron, sticking to the flesh of his palm. It was not easy to hold it, nor was it easy to throw it away. After a few seconds, Yukawa Isuk finally made up his mind. He gritted his teeth and said, "Then go ask him." Bai Xinyan smiled. She gestured to Yukawa Isuk to take a good look at the current state of the Pope's puppet. The latter's stiff, mummified appearance was the best reason. Yukawa Isuk took a deep breath. Huh. It was strange. After the previous round of torment, the atmosphere that made people dare not even breathe had become lively. Although the Pope's consciousness was probably still watching everything coldly, or maybe he was silently keeping score, at least for now, he didn't have the intention to blame anyone, let alone the strength to do so. Haha. Whether it was a brilliant realization or a broken pot, Yukawa Isuk's breathing had indeed become a lot livelier. The corner of his mouth twitched. He threw the bottle of water in his hand back to Bai Xinyan. You came to this conclusion after observing for such a long time? Bai Xinyan caught it firmly. She unscrewed the cap and took a big gulp without any misgivings. She exhaled a long breath, looking like she was drinking fine wine. I didn't need to observe to come to this conclusion. Since you made a move against him, did you not read Persona? Persona. Oh, I did. Yukawa Isuk still had an impression of it. The target of this intelligence analysis, named Persona Mask, was Luo Nan. The information had been published more than half a year ago. At that time, Luo Nan was using the cage theory to sweep away the traditional soul theory of the inner world. It was quite popular for a time, but the analysis itself was a bit secretive. The follow-up was not followed up in time, so it slowly lost its popularity. The version in Yukawa Isuk's hands also included the comprehensive analysis of various sources by his family's intelligence personnel. The research was more comprehensive than the one on the market. But what did Bai Xinyan mean by mentioning it? Bai Xinyan took a big gulp of mineral water. Her eyes wandered as if she was tipsy. Ask. Answer. According to the logic of the persona mask, Professor Luo has three basic faces: rationality, strength, and weakness. Which face are we facing now? It's rationality. It wasn't Yukawa Isuk who answered. It was the Pope's puppet that let out a buzzing sound. Chapter 853. Yukawa Isuk confirmed that it was the papal puppet who spoke. The puppet's lips moved slightly as it made a sound. But other than that, there was no other change. The dim pupils were still pointing at the spiritual sea mimicry map. Your Majesty also watches Persona? On the other side, Bai Xinyan quickly changed the topic of conversation. Her reaction was lively and quick, a stark contrast from the honest operator a few minutes ago. In fact, ever since Bai Xinyan took the initiative to speak and handed over the bottle of water, her attitude had changed subtly. This made Yukawa Isuk wonder if he was just a prelude to the previous round of conversation. While he was suspicious, Yukawa Isuk was actually listening attentively to hear how the Pope would respond. But before he could do that, another wave of low vibrations entered the cabin. The intensity of the sound wave was average, but it just so happened to resonate with the structure of the airship. For a moment, the cabin windows and seats were buzzing, and the vibrations numbed everyone's limbs and lumbar spine. Obviously, it was not only the first-class cabin that was experiencing this. Yukawa Isuk could already hear the screams from the other cabins. To be honest, Yukawa Isuk was also a little panicked. At this moment, the papal puppet's whisper sounded again in the buzzing vibration. Shrink. Yukawa Isuk could no longer understand the professional jargon behind it. Bycinyan reacted quickly and started a new round of operation on the spiritual sea mimicry map. The scale of the spiritual sea mimicry map seemed to be increasing, showing more details. Of course, probably only the Pope and Bycinyan could understand it. What Yukawa Isuk saw was a simple electrocardiogram on the interface, sometimes on the left, sometimes on the right, moving up and down. But forgive his poor eyesight, even if the details in some areas had increased, there was no obvious change on the whole. Only a professional would be able to figure out the trick from this. It doesn't seem to be suitable. Bycinyan's voice sounded again, as if she was regretting it. But in the current situation, it sounded awkward no matter how one listened to it. The papal puppet did not make any obvious movements. Beneath its half-closed eyelids, it still vaguely gazed at the mimicry image of the spiritual sea. Just when everyone thought that this scene would continue, a low, mosquito-like voice rang out. What do you think? It's just not very suitable. The Pope puppet did not waste any more energy to speak, only glancing over with its gloomy and lightless eyes. His cold gaze got rid of the casual air that had just appeared in Bycinyan's body. She instinctively bowed, and the smile on her lips became much more restrained. Please forgive me, Your Highness. I didn't speak clearly. Actually, it was Your Highness who helped me to roughly understand the design of the mimicry image of the spiritual sea. That's how I came up with this idea. If there's anything I don't understand, I hope Your Highness can enlighten me. After talking for a while, Bycinyan went straight to the point. The parameters set up by Your Majesty are based on the airship tourists. It's the structure of the spiritual sea built by the airship tourists. This structure was more in line with the main background from last time in Ban City. The results that appeared were more comparable. But the problem was that His Majesty and the Lord True God had descended. Junior Luo Nan didn't dare to linger. He fled far away and only played around in the periphery. The structure built by the hundreds of passengers on the yacht was clearly insufficient in terms of coverage. Therefore, I boldly guess that Your Highness should take the initiative to graft this layer of structure with the power projected by the Lord True God. He forcefully spread it out and expanded its coverage, allowing Luo Nan's methods to leave traces on it as much as possible. The Pope puppet did not have any obvious reaction to Bycinyan's narration. Next to her, Yukawa Isuk listened very seriously. Of course, he didn't quite understand, but his imagination was pretty good. The scene of the Pope spreading out a thick pancake and sending it to the true God's hands to spin in circles or cast a net to catch fish appeared in his mind. That was probably what it meant. The Pope didn't object. That meant he acknowledged it. Wait a minute. Weren't Yukawa Isuk and the others also passengers on the airship? In other words, they were also part of the ingredients for this pancake? Bycinyan seemed to have heard his thoughts as he let his imagination run wild. She tilted her head and smiled. Yes. The distance between us and Professor Luo is much closer than we imagined. It's like an oil slick on the surface of the water, or a fly sticker. Yukawa Isuk's expression was a bit stiff. He turned to look at his head bodyguard. Kitano Sakuto stood upright like a wooden stake. Yukawa Isuk could get his answer from this guy's reaction. The problem right now is that Luo Nan's methods are a bit unreasonable. It's beyond my expectations. The Pope puppet's cracked and bloodless lips opened and closed slightly. Its voice was weak and vague, but its meaning was clear. He can hide, and he can counterattack. The voice stopped for a few seconds. It seemed as if it was unwilling to mention it. It seemed as if it was pondering over its words. But in the end, it still determined Luo Nan's behavior. It's very pure. Bycinyan didn't seem to understand. She asked, what do you mean by pure? The papal puppet wanted to continue speaking, but what flowed from its mouth this time was dark red froth of blood. Bai Xinyan let out an ah. She still spoke in a regretful tone. This body has finally reached its limit. Your Majesty, is there any other way to persevere? As soon as these words left her mouth, Bai Xinyan immediately received a dozen gazes from all around her. Especially the bodyguards who were trying their best to hide in the shadows. They looked like they were about to collapse. The problem was that their wills were never taken into consideration. That included Bai Xinyan. In the next second, an indescribable shadow filled the eyes of everyone in the first-class cabin. Yukawa Aishuk felt as if he had taken a step into the shade of the branches and leaves under the sun. To be more precise, he himself was part of the shade. He faced the blazing sun while weaving the shadows. Everyone in the first-class cabin was probably doing this. This shade was not meant for them to enjoy. The Pope puppet was completely motionless. Having used up its last drop of blood essence, it had completely turned into a dried corpse. Meanwhile, the Pope's will, which had borrowed the existence of its corpse, conveniently entered the tree's shade. Using an exquisite guiding power, it intersected the branches and leaves in all directions, ultimately forming a tree nest that was the structure of a spiritual vessel. A wonderful feedback came. Yukawa Aishuk suddenly realized that he had a bit of the ability to communicate in the mental realm. This ability was undoubtedly given to him by the Pope. It was also decided by his current state. In the end, the Pope switched to the mode of mental projection. This time, there was no one to act as a power bank. It was probably because the same method was not suitable for a third time. He could only settle for the next best thing, thus, everyone present, including Yukawa Aishuk, became the framework of the so-called tree nest. As for what the tree nest was, not many people understood. It was because it was a construct on the mental plane. According to Yukawa Aishuk's understanding, the Pope used the magnetic fields of their lives to build a temporary nest or safe haven. This provided the conditions for a weak consciousness to stay in space. No one knew the specifics of the situation. Only one thing was certain. The Pope's consciousness could directly appear in their minds, turning into images and sounds to achieve communication. This is a mental technique, but it is not used on the emotional level of Yukawa. Instead, it comes and goes, directly affecting the space-time structure. The Pope seamlessly continued his previous evaluation and analysis of Luonan. This was an explanation for purity. Yukawa Aishuk should not have understood this. But in this tree nest shadow state, he muddle-headedly understood a lot of conceptual knowledge. He also possessed the ability to make preliminary analysis. It was as if there was a built-in AI operating. Because it was purity, it broke away from the level of the Pope's design. Although it would still have an impact, this impact was no different from the impact of nature's wind, rain, thunder, and lightning. It was practically impossible to capture Luonan's special interference mode through the sea of consciousness mimicry. In other words, the Pope's plan was ruined. Yukawa Aishuk seemed to have split into two sides. One side had the normal thoughts of a mortal, and the other floated on the supernatural plane. He did not even have the time to fear before he was pushed forward by the surging pressure of information. He could only do his best to adapt to his current state. The Pope was still communicating with Bai Xinyan. It's still useful. At least we know the upper limit of Luonan's level. He's much stronger than expected. And we also know that Luonan's forte is not in making a fuss over people's emotions. Instead, he bypassed the path of controlling other people's fates and entered the domain of pure configuration design. Especially space-time configurations. It's still related to the situation in Ban City. Without the restrictions of the material plane, the Pope was a lot more talkative. And it was the exquisiteness of his words that made Yukawa Aishuk think, I wonder how Luonan feels when he's being studied by an extraordinary. Amidst his thoughts, Yukawa Aishuk suddenly felt that the sunlight behind him had suddenly become extremely hot. At the same time, his fleshly body also captured a new wave of lightning and thunder. This made him understand, becoming at a tree nest, embedding itself into the mental framework, meant that it was closer to the battlefield? In a trance, a part of Yukawa Aishuk's consciousness was thrown into the depths of the hazy void. He touched upon the ever-changing battlefield of the true God and Luonan. Even though his brain was now implanted with the AI, he was still unable to experience the exquisite details. He could only feel some vague, symbolic feelings. Luonan really did seem to be embedded in the depths of the void. It was like the hidden chain lock of a precision machine. When it twisted and turned, there would be some deformation inside. But on the outside, it was always in a stable and smooth state. It satisfied the psychological instinct of people to pursue order. Not only did it conform to people's psychology, but it also conformed to the laws and principles of the world. Chapter 854. Yukawa Aishuk watched with rapt attention. For him, the battlefield outside of the intercontinental airship was still flashing with blurry images. But after seeing it many times, a certain logic naturally formed. As time passed, his condition improved significantly. In his days, it was as if an invisible thread was pulling him to a higher place, allowing him to see more clearly and more thoroughly. Everything happened in the shadows. It was silent and undetectable. It was as if a god had blessed him. His train of thought became exceptionally clear. He was no longer constrained by the present situation. He made some expansions and extensions. He felt that a true god's method of pursuit was like a dragnet. Luonan was like a fish in the net. The dragnet itself was very large. There was a certain amount of space for movement. The mesh was not small either. There was a possibility of escape at any time. Now that the airship was forced to turn back, it was advantageous for the true god and the Pope. After all, the closer they were to Ban City, the greater the control the true god had over the dragnet. They could shrink the mesh and give Luonan more pressure. Unexpectedly, you have the potential in this area. The Pope transmitted telepathically. The direction was very clear. It was directed at Yukawa Aishuk. Was he evaluating him? Yukawa Aishuk was startled and chilled. How did the Pope know what he was thinking? Well, it must be because of this damned tree nest. For an extraordinary like the Pope, it was not a big deal for him to use methods like mind reading. But this feeling was more or less the same as Luonan's invasion. Oh, there was still a difference. Luonan was a great thief. He suddenly came. It was unknown what path he took. By the time he came to his senses, he had already fallen into the trap. He was muddle-headed and tied up. The Pope, on the other hand, had an aura of open warfare. It was as if it was a matter of course. I came in and stayed. You do whatever you want. I just stared at you. The degree of perverseness was even cough. Yukawa Aishuk cut off his thoughts. He did not dare to think too deeply about it. He forced himself to think about positive issues. For example, that evaluation. In the field of ability users, the Pope's words were more or less the same. Could it be that he really had talent in this area for this person to think highly of him? He had seen too much and thought too much. He was getting a bit carried away. Yukawa Aishuk subconsciously pondered. If he could get through this, perhaps he could focus on developing this aspect? While he was lost in his own thoughts, the Pope gave his evaluation, and then conversed with Bycinyan. He's very restrained. He spins at a low speed and glides in neutral. The Pope also used an analogy to describe Luonan's current state. It was easy for everyone to understand. Bycinyan said, perhaps he can only maintain such a low consumption state in the void interlayer, and also avoid direct interference with the true God's power. It's a reasonable judgment, but it's a little perfunctory. It's all thanks to your Majesty's wisdom that I was able to think of these things. However, we are just small fries. It's fine for a short period of time, but if we continue to act as the carrier of the tree nest, and bear the pressure of Swanee's calculations, I'm afraid we'll soon be unable to do as we wish. So far so good. The Pope's reply was so cold that it made people's hearts sink. However, no one dared to contradict her. Bai Xinyan's actions were already extremely out of line. Yukawa Aishin's heart was stupefied. So that's how it is, but that's the only logical explanation. Who in this world was born with knowledge? Even if there was such a thing, it would most likely belong to the young man outside the airship who had dealings with the true God and the Pope. The pain came from the comparison. The clearer his heart was, the more bitter the comparison was. At this moment, Yukawa Aishin felt as if there was a poisonous spider crawling in his heart. Its limbs scratched the tip of his heart, and there was a web of silk entanglement. There were no external injuries, but he always felt as if poison was slowly seeping in. It was extremely stifling. But in this current state, he could not help it. Very quickly, his attention was drawn away by the miraculous changes in the hazy void. Even though Yukawa Aishin knew that this was only a temporary ability given to him by the Pope, he still enjoyed the process of being able to observe, analyze, and make judgments. After all, this was an extraordinary ability that he had always yearned for. Its level was high, its profoundness was profound, and it far exceeded his imagination. He greedily perceived the mysteries within the structure of space and time, especially from the perspective of the true God and the Pope. After he shared the Pope's burden and received the blessing, it became easier to cut in and understand. Well, he still seemed to understand, but he wasn't. Especially when his rationality was still a mess, but he always felt that there was a side of his heart that was crystal clear and crystal clear. I still have talent, it's just that I haven't developed it yet. Yukawa Aishin kept encouraging himself. As the head of a large family, he did not lack confidence. It was just that he was forced into a field that he was not good at, and it was inevitable that he would feel inferior. Now, this half-yin, half-yang, suddenly bright and suddenly dark state gave him a reason to convince himself. It also allowed his thoughts to maintain a good state on a logical level. He was thinking again, judging from the airship's return, and the Pope's constant switching of mental states, the two of them probably did not expect the current situation at the beginning. Transcendents were indeed not gods. They also had their limits, be it in terms of strength or calculation. In the past, he had only deduced it in theory, but now he was seeing it with his own eyes. And because of this, he could never become a believer. Deep in his heart, a subtle thought spun. Yukawa Aishin suddenly felt dizzy and nauseous. But his mind was exceptionally clear, and the discomfort in every part of his body was transmitted to him, layer by layer. In an instant, too much information accumulated, and his brain felt like it was on fire. With a muffled groan, Yukawa Aishin curled up into a ball. In the real world, Bai Xinyan handed him another bottle of water and patted his back kindly. Keep your mind blank, all this information is giving you too much pressure, it's not good for your body to think too much. Huff, huff. Yukawa Aishin could only gasp for air. How could he have the strength to respond? You still need to work on your foundation. The Pope's consciousness came again, like a chilly wind blowing into the depths of his mind. It's rare to have such talent. Go back to Osaka and train in the Amaterasu heavenly court for a while. Yukawa Aishin's mind was confused, and his heart was filled with joy, worry, and fear. For a moment, he did not know how to respond. In fact, he felt that even if he did not say it, the Pope should be able to dig out these emotions from the bottom of his heart. What he needed was just a superficial statement. Just as he started, the shadow of the tree nest suddenly shook. No, it should be a sudden impact on the physical plane, enveloping everyone and every plane. Everything happened so suddenly that Yukawa Aishin didn't know what angle he should observe from, but in the end, he didn't have to choose. Because at this moment, whether it was on the spiritual plane that the Pope was guiding or on the physical plane that his mortal body could perceive, there was a sudden rush of water vapor and a sudden coolness. Bai Xinyan made a footnote for this phenomenon. Finally, we hit it. Chapter 855. The intercontinental airship had completed its turn. It was as if it had crashed into a cumulonimbus cloud. Plentiful water vapor and high-altitude astral winds intertwined, instantly blurring the portholes on both sides. Then, a nearly parallel waterline was drawn above the airship. In the dark environment, the cloud was like a demon. It danced outside the porthole and was cut into pieces by the waterline. Yukawa Aishuk looked at the changes in the environment between light and dark. He was suddenly inspired. In his daze, he forgot about the severe discomfort in his body. At this moment, he seemed to see the aftermath of the collision between Luo Nan and a true god in the void. The collision was so intense that even the sealed cabin seemed to be leaking. Yes, it was the feeling of water vapor blowing on one's face. Yukawa Aishuk saw Kitano Suzuto subconsciously wipe his face. Kitano Suzuto's back was facing the direction of the airship. The Pope communicated with Bai Xinyan in the shadow of the tree nest. This was his evaluation of the sudden phenomenon. Nothing solid. You've locked onto it? No. The progression is so beautiful. This was the first time in Yukawa Aishuk's memory that the Pope had an emotional sigh. For a while, there was no response from within the tree nest until the airship shook again. The second wave, the third wave. The shaking of the airship was closely related to the structural changes in the depths of the cloud. Due to the distribution of computational pressure, the relevant information flowed and circulated in the shadow of the tree nest, peeling off layer by layer. Of course, some people knew less and some people knew more. Yukawa Aishuk could see it relatively clearly. He knew that the water vapor cloud was the product of the collision between Luo Nan and the true god. Luo Nan used the condensation ring as the basic interference core. It was destined to rely on an abundant water vapor environment. The true god carried out a strong suppression. The collision of the two sides on the material plane caused the water vapor in the sky to condense and explode abnormally, creating this cloud phenomenon. Because of this, the cool feeling of the water vapor was able to penetrate the obstruction of the airship's outer shell and directly affect the people's bodies and minds. It's mixed with fragments from the collapse of the void. If the intensity is increased, this airship will be cut to pieces. But then it will be completely at the extraordinary level. Yukawa Aishuk's thoughts seemed to have left his identity as a passenger and jumped out of his own dimension. With incredible focus, he observed and evaluated the increasingly intense battle. Luo Nan and the true god were currently locked in front of the airship, in contrast to the aimless pursuit of Luo Nan. Because of this, the scale of the cumulonimbus cloud that the airship crashed into continued to expand. The airship's strategy was to increase its altitude in an attempt to avoid danger, but the effect was really suspicious. Dark clouds continued to surge in the surroundings. Between the layers of clouds, lightning and fire swam about, flickering and extinguishing. Some of them even struck straight at him. Although they were all blocked by the insulating armor on the outer layer, the thunderous roar still crushed in. Each strike was louder than the last, each strike stronger than the last. The cries and screams from the lower cabins never ceased. This stalemate was really absurd. According to Yukawa Aishuk's observations, the true god should have locked onto Luo Nan's relative position. It was relative to Luo Nan's current functional region within the space-time structure. Right now, he was still bombarding Luo Nan's outer shell. He had yet to truly explore the core. Luo Nan was still hidden deep within the void, and the true god was constantly trying to squeeze him out from the space-time structure. For this reason, Luo Nan adopted an unprecedented proactive attitude. He forcefully interfered with the plentiful water vapor of the material plane, forming some sort of defense system. He used the mutual interference between the mental and the material plane to continuously dissolve the true god's attacks. This was what the Pope meant by progressive levels. Thoughts that even he himself found hard to understand revolved wildly in Yukawa Aishuk's mind. It was like a drill, drilling deeper and deeper, getting closer and closer to that mysterious and unfathomable level. But unwittingly, he drilled through the limits of his body. In the end, he collapsed. His vision went black, and his mind suddenly went blank. Yukawa Aishuk's figure fell forward, falling out of his seat. Fortunately, Kitano Sueto reacted in time. He extended his arm to block, preventing Yukawa Aisuke from hitting the ground. But at this moment, the shadow of the tree nest was affected by Yukawa Aisuke's mental disruption. It lost an important support, and the structure of the mental plane suddenly shook. Yukawa Aisuke fainted in time, so he wasn't affected. As for the others, whether it was Baisinyan, Kitano Sueto, or the group of bodyguards, they were all affected to varying degrees. For a moment, the sky was dark, and there was strong light and high temperature that penetrated the shadow barrier. It was much more refreshing than being exposed to the sun. Several people let out muffled groans. Most likely, they suffered damage on the mental plane. The Pope's telepathic thoughts paused for a moment, and then the structure of the tree nest returned to normal. But at this moment, the mummified puppet suddenly fell to the ground. Baisinyan, who was in front of him, didn't reach out. She watched as the corpse fell to the ground with a muffled thud. Baisinyan's eyebrows twitched. She could confirm that the Pope had left the last bit of blood essence in the puppet's body to save the situation. He had burned it in this accident. She sighed. Sometimes, having the ability is a problem. Yeah. The Pope's telepathic thoughts were quite steady. He didn't have any intention of venting his anger, and he couldn't find a reason to be angry. Anyone with eyes could see that Yukawa Aisuke's fall was almost certain. His thoughts were unexpectedly compatible in the field of space-time configuration, which caused the analytical pressure to be too great, and his physical fitness couldn't keep up. It was like using a primitive single-cylinder engine to drag a heavy truck, and still having to run at the speed of an F1. It was only a matter of time before the tank exploded. Since the Pope had used the structure of the tree nest to divert some of the pressure to others, and obtained the effect of reducing the pressure, he had to bear the corresponding risk. Baisinyan timely said, "Misfortune may be a blessing in disguise. I still have to congratulate Your Majesty on obtaining another beautiful and talented person." In the shadow of the tree nest, she could no longer feel the Pope's emotional response. It was as if he had sunk into emptiness and swallowed the corresponding information. But Baisinyan still had a feeling that something had been hooked by an invisible claw, and disappeared without a trace. Was it the Pope's firm judgment and confidence? Baisinyan frowned slightly. Half a second later, she suddenly stood up, and directly stepped over the mummified corpse of the Pope's puppet, and walked to the front of the first-class cabin. Kitano Sueto, who was in front, was stunned for a moment. He quickly used the opportunity to help his boss settle down to make a path. The Pope was still there, but the puppet still had some kind of symbolic meaning. When the puppet fell, it was as if a switch had been flipped, and an invisible layer of restraint was released from the body of the people. Baisinyan was only the first to verify it. The advantage of intercontinental airships over traditional passenger planes was that they were stable, safe, and relatively spacious. The first-class cabin was also first-class in terms of space utilization and enjoyment. There was even a small observation deck at the front, which was the best view of the entire airship, second only to the cockpit. But it was night time, and there had been many unforeseen events. The observation deck was wrapped in thick armor, and it was tightly sealed. Of course, this was not a problem for Baisinyan. After a few steps, the outer armor was slowly opened under her permission. When Baisinyan walked up to the observation deck, footsteps sounded behind her. It was Kitano Sueto. This head bodyguard of the Yuchuan family, even if it was just a physical body, was still a B-level powerhouse. In the structure of the tree nest, he was shouldering a lot of the pressure. Correspondingly, he also had his own thoughts about the situation, but he was just suppressing them. Baisinyan did not care what he was thinking. She looked at the dark clouds in front of her. Just then, another lightning bolt struck down from the sky, illuminating the outline of the clouds that were like the precipice of an abyss. The incoming clouds were like beasts and demons that lived among them. They hit the outer shell of the airship and instantly shattered, then reassembled into other demonic shapes. After a second, Kitano Sueto, who was beside her, let out a low gasp. Over there. What affected his breathing was not the cloud phantom that was pouncing at him, but an area further away, between the flowing and changing clouds, there was an obvious difference. How to put it, if the outer layer of scattered clouds was peeled off, the central area was obviously also made of clouds, but the outline was sharp, orderly, and full of artificial sturdiness. Another lightning bolt struck down, directly piercing through the outer layer of clouds and bombarding that area. In the eyes of Bai Xinyan and Kitano Sueto, faint ripples appeared in the void. The lightning bolt warped and curled around the periphery of that area until it dissipated. Some of the dissipated lightning eventually broke through, collapsing a corner of the cloud structure. But soon, lightning surged to fill the gap. It was still a square block, but it felt even more sturdy. It was simply a defensive fortification built by relying on the cloud mountain. Or perhaps it was a towering mountain pass in front of the airship. No matter how the outer layer of clouds changed, no matter how powerful the lightning bolt struck, that area continued to be fortified. It gave people the feeling that if the airship were to collide with it, it would most likely be smashed into smithereens. A fortress of the Ring of Bloodwill? Bai Xinyan glanced over. This one sentence proved that Kitano Sueto had done his homework on Luonan. Of course, this was due to the fact that this toy was famous. It only existed in the circle of ability users in Xia City. It was a marvelous configuration design that spread through all sorts of channels. If it were projected onto the plane of reality, it would probably look like this. Bai Xinyan did not object. She just muttered, "The Ring of Bloodwill Fortress?" The two of them spoke one after another, but before they could really communicate, a strong light suddenly burst out of the gloomy clouds. In the blink of an eye, it surpassed the level of lightning. The light was as dazzling as the sun, but it did not follow the trajectory of the sky at all. Instead, it fell straight towards the pass ahead. At this moment, the cumulonimbus clouds with abundant water vapor seemed to have been ignited. You're tuning into the Romantic Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.